Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Mysteries of Magic in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 21, What Has Been Caused by Magic. She needed to find Hubert before it was too late. He had given the impression that he didn't know why she was in Shamhala, but nonetheless, he knew that she was there. Not to mention, he had managed to create a magical connection to her that was strong enough for them to speak with each other for several minutes, even if merely in a dream. That must mean that he was somewhere nearby, surely? She padded quietly to the door, listening for sounds outside. She could hear nothing out of the ordinary, but even if there were no guards placed outside her door, she didn't doubt that they would have a watchful eye on her door somehow. It was clear that she had been deceived. She was not a guest here, but a prisoner. Leaning her back against the door, she took a moment to breathe slowly and collect her thoughts. She needed to come up with a plan that included 3 things: 1. Escaping this room unnoticed, 2. Finding the real Hubert, and 3. Leaving Shamhala together with Hubert, preferably alive. How in the world was she supposed to do that? She sank to the floor, burying her face in her hands with a soft groan. If only Yuri had been here. He would already have formed a plan, several even, that they could pick and choose from. But she was alone, and she couldn't trust that Hubert would be of much help when she found him either. For all she knew, he could be dead already. No. Do not think of that now. She needed to keep a clear head if she was to get out of this alive together with Hubert. So what would Yuri have done? She tried to channel him, imagining what he would be saying if he was there with her. "You look like hell, shady lady. Ever heard of beauty sleep?" She scoffed at herself. No, he wouldn't say that. Perhaps her mental image of him from several years ago would, but she knew him well enough now to know better. She tried again, imagining that he stood beside her in the room. "Hey, come on, there'll be time to sleep later. We need to save your lover." With a sigh, she leaned her head back against the door, letting her hands slip from her face. Well, that was more like it, she supposed. But she wasn't sleeping, she was despairing. Couldn't he see the difference? Still a waste of time. "Come on, get up. I have a plan." Feeling somewhat silly for placing her trust in an imaginary Yuri, she nonetheless stood up and turned toward the door, placing a palm against the cold material. What plan could there possibly be? She didn't know the layout of the city. She didn't know what kind of technology they had, only that it was far above anything she had ever seen, and if she left this room, they would surely capture her in an instant. What if they wouldn't? Yuri asked in her mind. You may not know their technology, but perhaps the same can be said for them. They don't know what you're capable of. He had a point. Assuming that Hubert hadn't actually told them anything, they must have found out about her crest some other way. And that could mean that they didn't have any knowledge of what kinds of magic she knew. Casting elder magic was risky, considering that it was their very area of expertise, but what about faith magic? They had turned their backs on the goddess after all. Perhaps their knowledge of faith magic was limited. She recalled Hubert's reaction when she had showed him her light spell by the pond at Gareg Mach. He had taken it in with a wondrous expression on his face, clearly surprised and fascinated by what she had been able to achieve. And that was Hubert, who had taken classes in magic by none other than Byleth, the faith master himself. Those who slithered in the dark surely had to know even less than him. Perfect, imaginary Yuri said. She could even see him smirk in her mind's eye. Now we're playing my kind of game. Dazzle them with your light magic. Or even better, use it to conceal yourself. If you can make images appear out of nothing, surely you can bend the light around real objects to trick the eye into thinking that they aren't there. She parted her lips, staring into the door as she considered this idea. Concealing herself from view? But she had never tried to use her light magic on a moving object. That's not true. Remember the tea? You made it change color even as it was being poured from the pot. And the surface of the pond moved as well, touched by the wind. That was true. She had some experience with moving objects, then. To conceal herself, however, was a much more energy-intensive endeavor, if she could even do it in the first place. It shouldn't be impossible, but it would be slow and dangerous, and she still didn't know where she was going, so she might be stumbling around Shamhala for hours and hours, exhausted from bending the light around herself for so long. Are you sure you don't have a way to figure out where he is? No spell to sense him nearby? Nothing comes to mind at all. She rolled her eyes at her own Yuri. She didn't much care for his tone, but his implication was clear. Of course she had a spell to locate Hubert, but she didn't know whether it would work in Shamhala, and whether Thales and his cohorts would notice magic of such magnitude being cast in their city. While her lightning magic might not be visible to the sheer eye, it was powerful and physical, and if she accidentally sent it through another human body, they might be able to discern its power. Do you have a better idea? Yuri asked. She thought for another moment, raking her mind for a better solution, but no, nothing did come to mind. She sighed, leaning her forehead against the door. This might be one of the most foolish things she would ever do, perhaps even the last thing she would ever do. But she knew that it was likely her only chance to locate Hubert in time to save him. If this fails, I will blame you, Yuri, she whispered. You mean you'll credit me when you succeed? She huffed in amusement. At least with imaginary Yuri, she wouldn't actually have to live up to any promises made in a weak moment. She silently promised to give him credit if she managed to survive, meaning, in fact, that she would only be crediting herself, but there was no need to tell him that, and then, closing her eyes, she carefully called on her lightning. The second that the tendrils of magic shot out from her fingertips, she knew that something was very wrong, but she couldn't rein it in fast enough to stop. Her lightning magic had latched onto something that was very much neither a human body nor any kind of material she had ever come upon before, and it latched onto it with such vigor that all the air rushed out of her lungs at the force of it. A large, sprawling network had opened itself up beneath her fingertips, spreading so far that she couldn't even see the end of it, and her magic was eagerly running through it, pushing its way through every corner and angle of the network as it explored long lines of power wrapping around the entire city. Constance nearly lost herself in it, gaping at the sheer immensity of the branch work. For every second, her mental map of it grew tenfold as her magic kept flowing further and further away from her. And there was something else there, too, asking her, begging her to utilize its power. It took her much too long to realize that she must have somehow connected to the city's magical blue veins, but when she did, she immediately reined her magic back in, stumbling back blindly as it slammed into her again. She slapped a hand over her mouth as violent coughs forced their way up through her throat, her lungs irritated by the force of impact against her chest. Her hand was trembling. What in the world? Even imaginary Yuri was stumped, staring at her with wide eyes as she tried to regain her bearings. Did you just? Yes, she breathed, wrapping her arms around herself as she bent over double. The city works on lightning magic. It couldn't be true, could it? This was a city built from elder magic. And yet, she had felt the power at her fingertips, buzzing and pulsating, asking her for commands. If only this hadn't been a life or death situation, she would have loved to explore it further, but as it stood, it seemed dangerous to try again. But you didn't find Hubert, did you? I do not know if I can, she whispered. I don't know how to direct my magic away from the blue veins. It wants to flow through it. Without more experience, I do not see a way to divert its attention. Then don't. Let it run freely. See where it takes you. The thought made her pause, her fingers flexing automatically as she considered it. See where it took her. Well, it was better than doing nothing, she supposed, and if she was fortunate, she might find something that could help her figure out where Hubert was. Taking a deep breath and straightening in front of the door, she closed her eyes again as she called the lightning to her fingertips. It complied willingly, eager to return to the strange and exciting network. This time, she was better prepared for the sensation. While she had always considered her lightning magic a sixth sense of sorts, this was on an entirely different level. As her magic swept through the branches at the speed of light, she formed an image in her mind of the whole city and its paths in the walls and floors. It almost felt as though she could reach out and touch it with her hands, or even control it if she wanted to. She had the distinct sensation that she might even be able to overcharge the network with her magical energy, possibly damaging its branches. Was this common knowledge among elder mages? Did they all wield some variant of lightning magic? She couldn't remember ever having seen Hubert cast such magic. Now that she dared to push through as far as she could, she quickly realized that some of the lines terminated in what seemed as dead ends, and some of these, in turn, led her to human shapes. The human beings were fuzzy, even more than usual when she sensed through an area, but she was able to determine that they were not people she recognized, at least. All of them were interacting with the blue veins in the buildings and floor in some way, borrowing their energy for strange devices that vibrated with power. She carefully went through each instance of these, eliminating all alternatives as leading her only to strangers. Until she found something or someone that stuck out from the rest. Someone who was not merely using the power of the veins, but who instead was connected to them. She frowned, trying to zero in on the sensation. This shape was even fuzzier and duller than the others, as though barely alive. Her breath caught as she realized that this may very well be Hubert, struggling to endure whatever Thales might be subjecting him to. Commanding her magic to concentrate on this one area, which seemed to be just a few buildings away from her bedroom, she managed to focus on the shape closely enough to determine with good cause that it must be Hubert. He was lying down, his breathing dangerously shallow, but he was still alive. We are not out of time just yet. Worrying that she might alert someone to her presence if she remained for too long, she withdrew from the network, returning to reality with a shiver as she opened her eyes again. Filled with new determination, she pushed open the door far enough that she could see a sliver of the hallway outside, but gently enough that it hopefully shouldn't alert anyone nearby. She couldn't see anyone in the hallway. Through a window on the opposite wall, she could glimpse the back streets of Shamhala, where figures she didn't recognize walked along the streets. She briefly wondered what day-night cycles the inhabitants of Shamhala went by. Without a sun to guide them, would it still be custom to sleep at this time of night, or would the main streets be filled with people? She took a deep breath. She couldn't hesitate, Hubert might not have enough time for her to waste. Releasing the door again, she walked back into the room and stood in front of one of the mirrors by the wardrobes, cringing slightly at the sight of her so disheveled. Her hair was unbrushed and her clothes wrinkled and speckled with dirt, but she pushed it out of her mind, focusing instead on preparing to cast her light magic. While she wouldn't exactly call herself an amateur at faith magic at this point, black magic still came more easily to her. But she'd had her fair share of practice at casting faith magic over the past years, and together with the elder magic she had learned and practiced, which had many aspects that were similar to faith magic, the magic circle and the order of the glyphs and symbols were simple enough to channel. "Dear Goddess, if you can hear me, please grant me your power," she whispered as she clasped her hands together in front of her chest. She might be overly cautious, praying to the goddess so expressly, but if it could help strengthen her magic further, it would be worth it tenfold. As the magic circle appeared before her, glowing and spinning in all its glory, Constance felt the power build up within and the familiar sensation of bright hope warm her insides. Unclasping her hands, she let the magic stream through her limbs and into her fingertips as she began to weave the light around herself. Keeping a close eye on her reflection in the mirror, she guided the waves of light into new pathways around her body, painstakingly hiding the different parts of her body from even her own view one by one. First her feet, then her ankles, then her calves faded away into nothing. And along with them, so did her energy reserves. She could already sense that sustaining this magic and adapting it to the changing light conditions as she moved through Shamhala would drain her energy very quickly. She would need to hurry straight toward the chambers where she had sensed Hubert. She watched the last parts of her disappear in the mirror and took a moment to study the end results. With knowledge of her presence, it would still be quite easy to discern that she was standing there. She wasn't strong enough to create a perfect veil of light around herself, so there were small ripples and other strange imperfections in the air where she stood. With a sigh, she told herself that it would have to do. There was no time to work on the spell for any longer, and even if there had been, it would only drain her further. Taking a small step forward, she tested the flexibility of the magic to see how quickly it would fail and reveal her. To her great relief, only slight adjustments were needed to keep her hidden, and as long as she moved slowly, she could manage them rather well. Even when she turned away from the mirror, thus unable to determine with her own eyes whether she was still hidden, she could somehow sense how she needed to manipulate the light in order to keep the veil intact. The magic was pliant and obedient, almost eager to help her, and she caught herself wondering whether the goddess had truly heard her prayers. Perhaps the deity still had some faith in her, even after she had betrayed the church and delved into elder magic. Imaginary Yuri, who had been silent as she cast her magic, scoffed at that thought. I'd say it's more likely the goddess doesn't exist, and you're just that good. Smoke and mirrors, she murmured, recalling what real Yuri had told her around the time when she first started exploring elder magic. The faith level theory, according to which stronger faith magic could be cast by those closer to the goddess, clearly didn't hold water. Now go use some of those tricks to save your lover, shady lady. She winced as she walked toward the doors. She couldn't even escape his awful pet name for her in her own head. She hesitated by the doors, then turned back to move a few pillows beneath the blankets on the bed in the shape she hoped would look enough like a human being in the dusk lighting that if anyone looked inside, they would assume that she was asleep. When she was satisfied with the appearance, she returned to the doors and carefully nudged one open. The first daring steps out into the hallway were almost as anxiety-ridden as stepping into bright sunlight. She felt exposed, which was ironic considering that even if the hallway hadn't been empty, no one should have been able to spot her. The light veil held with her continuous adjustments as she walked down the hallway until she eventually reached two double doors which she suspected led outside. She had a faint memory of seeing two guards outside of the building. Were they still there? There were no windows in the doors, so she couldn't be certain. If they were there, perhaps she could distract them somehow? They'll check your room for sure if they suspect something's up, Yuri said. Yes, that seemed logical. But she couldn't exactly shatter the window and climb out without making a ruckus, and there were no other ways outside. Besides, Thales would surely keep an eye on all exits from the building. Not to mention Faux Hubert, who was supposedly resting somewhere in the vicinity. A shiver went through her body. So, how to leave unnoticed? A distraction coming from inside would make them suspicious. But a distraction coming from outside, on the other hand. Constance frowned. A distraction coming from outside. Yes, as long as they couldn't connect anything to her, they hopefully shouldn't check her room. And she believed she knew of a way to create a distraction outside. Temporarily lowering her magical veil of light so that she could draw on her reserves for other purposes, she called on her lightning magic a third time, feeling almost familiar in the network by now. She let her magic flow through the branches until they reached a point nearby, in a building on the opposite side of the street. She could visualize the blue-green veins running across the surface of the building, and before she could second-guess herself, she concentrated on one particular spot and pushed through with all of her magical might into it. The network was stronger than she had anticipated, holding against even the mightiest of forces she could upbring, but she could feel her power eating through its defenses, and so she pushed on. The burst came so unexpectedly and strongly that she had to struggle to stay connected as the sheer force of it tried to push her out. She wanted to make certain that she had indeed overpowered the branch and not simply run across some sort of safety mechanism in the network, but she wouldn't have needed to bother, because even from inside the hallway, she could hear a new ruckus outside. Releasing her hold of the network, she ran up to the doors and carefully nudged one of them open. She must have been correct about the guards. They now stood on the other side of the street, trying to calm a small crowd of people around them as the veins on the front of the nearby building sparked violently. As she watched, several more guards came running from another direction. These were dressed in mage robes. If she wanted to make full use of her distraction, she must do it quickly. Reshaping the light veil around her, she opened the doors just enough that she could slip through, and then made her way down the street as close to the walls as possible. Hubert, I am on my way. Light and shapes played in the corners of his eyes, low murmurs buzzing all around him. He was so cold he couldn't even hold back the shivers anymore. Struggling to keep his eyes open, he slowly rocked his head from side to side in an attempt to stay conscious. His breaths were fast and shallow, he couldn't seem to get a good lungful of air. Focus. Keep your head clear. But for how long? How long should I try to endure this before I finally allow myself to give up? Anxiety lay like a wet blanket over him, pressing against his chest and making it difficult to think of anything but the fact that he was going to die. He couldn't be sure whether it was just the anxiety playing tricks on his mind, or whether there truly was no other way out at this point, but trying to think clearly when his body was doing everything it could to beat him into submission was nearly impossible. He struggled weakly against his bonds in one last attempt to break free, but they just cut even more deeply into his skin. What had he thought? That he would suddenly be able to break loose now, when he knew that he hadn't been able to make them budge even at his full power. You will die here. Here, in a cold, suffocating room deep underground, with little of your senses remaining. Here, stripped of your dignity and brought to the very edge of your limits. This is where you will finally die. Yes. It was likely that he would. At least he had managed to reach through to Constance, with what little presence of mind he had left. Reaching out for her had been a desperate measure, one that he hadn't had much faith in. He didn't know whether to be relieved or devastated by the fact that he had managed it, since it meant that she must be somewhere in Shamhala as well. He could only hope that she would be able to find a way out somehow, and warn Lady Edelgard. Lady Edelgard. He could almost see her face now, her mouth set and her eyes cool, but with the telltale wrinkle of concern between her eyebrows as she was told of his demise. As long as she would know not to trust anyone who wore his face. As long as she had Constance by her side. Hubert. Tiredly, he blinked up into her face. Her eyes were filling with fear now, her mouth falling open as she called his name again. Light blonde hair framed her face, and some of it hung forward over him, tickling his forehead. A hand came up and pressed gently against his cheek. He leaned into it with a soft hum, feeling a warm calmness spread from her palm and into his body. Hubert, please, she pleaded, eyes widening in terror. Say something. Lady Edelgard, he said, fighting to properly enunciate the words. Do not be afraid. She shook her head. Another hand came up to press against his other cheek. No, she said in a voice brimming with panic. Hubert, I am not Lady Edelgard. Do you not recognize me? He frowned up at her, trying to interpret the features in the face hovering above his own. Bright, intelligent eyes. Lips like pink rose petals. A small, somewhat round nose. If this was not Lady Edelgard, then... He struggled to think. Someone who had similar features to Lady Edelgard? Sunshine, he mumbled, and at the instant relief in her face, he knew that he had guessed correctly. Despite feeling his heart sink at the realization that she had once again failed to comply with his orders, he huffed out an exhausted laugh. Of course. When did you ever do as I asked? She stroked some of his sweat-soaked hair out of his face. I am getting you out, she said, her gaze moving over to something next to him. What is this device? It has long tendrils of something, which are connected to your skin. It drains my blood, he breathed. A light tug in his arms told him that she had disconnected him from the machine. I need to break these bonds, as well, she said, seeming to speak more to himself than to him. But if I use my lightning magic, it might travel into your skin. Perhaps if there was, Her face disappeared from view, and then she mumbled something to herself that he couldn't discern. He focused on trying to breathe steadily through the anxiety that still held him in a firm grip. The danger was not over yet, he might still very well die, and if Constance was here, that meant that she was in great danger as well. No, he said, feeling a feverish fear rise within him. You must leave. Don't be ridiculous. I will not leave you here. Do you mean to say that you don't have faith in my ability to get us both out? I told you, he said slowly, powering through each word. You need to warn Lady Edelgard. If we both die. We will not die, and I will not leave you here. Do you understand? Either we both leave Shamhala, or neither of us does. He closed his eyes and turned his face away from her, trying to calm himself. She was completely unreasonable, but if he got himself worked up, he might just die sooner. Breathe. Think. And how, he asked slowly when he'd allowed himself a moment to smother his frustration, do you expect me to escape in this sorry state? I have a plan. Now be silent. You must save your energy. What energy? He thought tiredly. Some part of him had known that she wouldn't listen to his request, but he had still wanted to try. He didn't want to die here, but it was better than risking Lady Edelgard's vision and the future of Fodlan. Now, however, seeing that Constance wasn't budging, he supposed he needed to accept the situation and adapt. Always adapt. There was a clicking sound, and then Constance leaned over him again. He felt warm hands cover the wounds on his arms. I shall try to heal you as best I can, but I do not think that I can regenerate much of the blood that you have already lost. I might be able to speed up the process, however. She mumbled something below her breath again. The warmth in her hands seemed to slowly start to transfer into his body, pouring into his veins and running up his arms. He squirmed, wincing at the discomfort. It will be over soon, she said. White magic is not my forte, I'm afraid. He groaned. Perhaps refrain from telling your future patients that, he said with some effort, but he was already feeling a little energy return, and the worst haze was lifting. Point taken, she huffed. The warmth faded after another moment, and then her arms carefully wrapped around his torso. She was trying to pull him up into a seated position, but with little luck. Hubert, she complained. Can you help? Clenching his jaw, he exerted enough power to push himself forward with her help. His head spun, he gripped her shoulders before he could think, and she grabbed the sides of his torso to hold him steady. As he saw his own hands, he realized with faint surprise that she had managed to release him from his bonds. And then, in the next second, he remembered that he didn't have his gloves on. His hands twitched in an impulse to pull away, but he forced them to remain. Don't make a fool of yourself. Constance studied him with a concerned frown. They'd taken his clothes, leaving him in a simple white shirt and a pair of thin pants. Both his hands and his feet were bare. It wasn't like he needed his gloves or shoes where they'd meant for him to go. There is an Agar then walking around in your clothes, she said, lifting her gaze to meet his. Don't call them that, was his instinctive response, sputtered out with pure disgust. They're filth. Creeps slithering in the dark. Constance looked shocked by his outburst for a second, before her expression contorted into anger. You could not have told me that earlier. If you'd trusted me, he said slowly, and kept silent as I asked. Oh ho, that is rich, she exclaimed, throwing her head back. If I'd trusted you? What about yourself? You clearly didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. He squeezed his eyes shut, feeling his head spin again. She was not entirely wrong, but neither did she have the full picture. Fine. We can talk about it later, if we survive this. Opening his eyes again, he was relieved to see that she wasn't looking quite as angry anymore. He took a deep breath, powering through the pain and exhaustion to speak. They plan to replace me with one of their own permanently. To ascertain that they will have control of the empire even after we have defeated the church. None the wiser. Her face fell. Oh, she breathed, then looked away. I saw him. Their replacement for you. He was, she trailed off, but before he could ask her to elaborate, she looked back again and continued, is that what they need your blood for? Perhaps, he said, struggling somewhat to push through the remaining mind haze. Much of their methods and plans remain unknown to me. I do not know the secret behind their transformations. He paused to take in her expression, which was more fearful than angry now. She looked younger like this, reminding him of a young Lady Edelgard. Or perhaps it was his mind playing tricks on him again. You should not be here. Thales knows about your crest, and they. I know, she said, cutting him off. She looked away again, as though she was hesitant to continue. He wants me to go through the Elder Ritual and join their ranks, unless that was a lie, that is. He stared at her as he tried to work through what this meant. Of course. Thales had doubtlessly figured out that Hubert had tutored Constance in Elder Magic, and saw an opportunity to capitalize on it. They have the Noah Crest Stone, he said, watching shock spark in her eyes. They might have a compatible relic as well. If they could manipulate you into going through the ritual and joining their faction, if they could turn her against the Empire, you would be a magnificent weapon. And he had no doubt that it would be possible for Thales to manipulate Constance into joining them. Apart from all the power they could promise her if she joined them, they had also intended to replace him with one of their own, a puppet to use however they wanted. If someone with his face told Constance to trust them, she would be eating out of their hand within moments. The sudden realization that Constance likely trusted him enough that he would be able to manipulate her into something like that was almost more dizzying than the blood loss. She was completely silent now, blindly staring past him as she digested what he had just told her. And what a thing he had told her! Not only had she been informed that those who slithered in the dark had a crest stone from her ancestor in their possession, she was also forced to accept the fact that they had meant to use her as a puppet as well, alongside him. Feeling somewhat less weak and dazed after Constance's healing magic, he decided to take a risk by withdrawing his hands from her shoulders and using them to support himself on the machine table instead. He was still angry that she had compromised everything by running her mouth in front of Arundel, but that was a discussion for later. He couldn't help but feel responsible for pulling her into this in the first place. If he hadn't contacted her in the compendium, if he hadn't decided to tutor her in elder magic, she would have continued on her merry way, specialized in black magic, and never looked at him twice. She could have been blissfully unaware of Thales and his disgusting ilk. But instead, he had brought her into this mess, lying to her and deceiving her again and again, until finally he had her so completely under his thumb that she willingly followed one of the most dangerous people in Fodlan into the deepest parts of the underground and almost went through a dark ritual with unknown consequences just to be with him. Whatever selfish hopes and wishes he might have had for a future with her by his side, if they came out of this alive, he needed to stomp those dreams out. She deserved better. Much, much better. Constance lowered her gaze to one of his hands, and he could see the moment that her gaze caught on the black web-like pattern snaking its way up from his fingers and all the way to his wrist. There was a momentary pause in her breathing, and her pupils widened. He forced himself to stay still. "Hubert," she said quietly. "What does the ritual entail?" "That can wait," he said. "We can't remain here. You said you have a plan." To his dismay, she crossed her arms over her chest and shook her head. "We are not leaving until you have told me. Be quick about it if you can, but do not withhold the vital parts." Hubert exhaled deeply. He'd expected to have to answer that question sooner or later, but not like this. And he knew even before she said it that he couldn't refuse to answer this time. There was still the issue of leaving Shambhala unscathed somehow, but if there was anything he'd learned from all of the recent events, it was that keeping her in the dark about the important details did more damage than good. "Fair enough," he said with a sigh. "There are supposedly two variants. The most effective one, the one I went through, can only be performed by Thales and his dark bishops. The other one can be performed by any elder mage. Truth be told, I do not know for certain that it works. I haven't seen it with my own eyes, but I have read several sources swearing by it, and apparently the Church has been known to perform similar rituals with faith magic." "The ritual you would perform on me?" Constance said. When he nodded, she continued, "And how does it supposedly work?" "It involves drinking the blood of an elder mage who has gone through the full ritual," he said, watching her widen her eyes. "Could that be what they need your blood for?" "I doubt it. There is no reason why they would need mine over anyone else's." She nodded slowly, considering this. "And the full ritual? What does it entail?" He hesitated as he tried to decide on how to phrase it. "Explaining it in detail will take more time than we have. In brief, it involves implanting Agarthan technology into the body, as a supplementary power source which allows for more powerful magic." Constance covered her mouth with her hand, staring at him in silence. Her gaze flickered down to his chest, and he immediately knew what she was thinking. He carefully unbuttoned the top 4 buttons on his shirt with one hand, then pulled the fabric away from his chest to reveal the scar over his heart. She shook her head, clearly uncomfortable about the revelation. "What are you saying?" she asked in a wavering voice, having lowered her hand to speak. "In order to perform the ritual on me, Thales permanently stopped my heart and implanted a crest stone imbued with their technology into my chest. So you see, I am more similar to Thales and Solon than I would perhaps like to be. And in some ways, even to Byleth." Constance vehemently shook her head. "What has been caused by magic can be undone by magic." "Perhaps," he acknowledged as he buttoned his shirt again, "although it is likely I would die if the stone was removed. But that simply cannot." She trailed off and lowered her gaze. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "I made my choice," he assured her in a low voice, "and I stand by it. The stone in my chest has granted me access to magic I could only ever dream of wielding before the ritual. It has served Lady Edelgard well. And now, if we are fortunate, it might help us escape this place. Constance looked up into his face with a defeated sigh. Yes. Escape. She glanced toward the door. The room they were in was small and windowless, filled with whirring machines. He had no idea how she'd managed to find him here, but they had wasted enough time on questions. Now was the time for action. Slowly, he pushed himself off the machine and onto his feet, still supporting himself against it with one hand. He gritted his teeth against the dizziness and pain that immediately surged through him. Constance rushed forward to help, but he held up a hand to stop her, shaking his head. He just needed a moment. So, he said when the room had stopped spinning so violently, the plan you mentioned. He was used to always having plans, extra plans and emergency plans on top of contingency plans, and so he absolutely hated being this powerless and dependent on someone else in a situation like this. He doubted Constance's plan was perfect, but hopefully it was at least plausible, because so far, he had none of his own. Yes, she said thoughtfully. I made it here by concealing myself with light magic, so my plan was to do the same again. However, I realize now that I may have exhausted some of my reserves by casting such demanding magic earlier. That, and, the door seems to have locked behind me, and I could not get it open again. Hubert raised his eyebrows, expecting her to continue to go on to her contingency plan, but when she simply looked back at him with a wince, he realized she didn't have any. He squeezed his eyes closed. She went against my orders. Risked her life. Told me she had a plan. And there is nothing? She had just gone to save him on impulse? I know what you are thinking, she said quickly. But there was no time to come up with a sound strategy. Had I waited for longer, you might not even have been conscious. Fantastic, he said, opening his eyes to glare at her. You threw away your own life as well as possibly every single other life in Fodlan, and for what? She let out an affronted gasp. For you. To save you. I didn't ask you to save me, he retorted sharply. In fact, I believe I asked the opposite. Yes, you asked me to leave you behind. But how could I? Why would you throw everything away, he growled, just for a negligent sliver of a chance to save me? How could you be so reckless? So thoughtless. He'd raised his voice at the last part, spitting out the very last word like a venomous dagger. She flinched, proving that he'd hit a vulnerable point. It wasn't satisfying to see, and he didn't want to yell at her, but she was so. Because I love you, she said with a trembling voice. His thoughts grinded to a halt. She. What? No. He looked away, feeling the little blood he had left in his body buzz in his ears. Don't, he forced out. Don't do this. Not now. Would you leave me here? If it was the other way around, she pushed, gesturing toward the machine. Would you leave me to die? Even if it was for the good of Fodlan. Yes, he growled, turning his head to glare at her again. She looked fragile. Exposed. All the better if he wanted to reach through to her. Don't you understand? I've told you time and time again, you will never come first. She shook her head, brow furrowing. I do not need to come first, she said. I understand that your first place is already occupied. I would never ask you to choose me over Lady Edelgard. He bared his teeth, clenching the edge of the machine with his hand so hard that it cut into his palm. Then what do you want from me? He was growing frustrated. He thought they had already established this, that there was no way he could give her what she wanted. She would never be satisfied. While she might think now that it wouldn't be an issue, he knew better. She would be unhappy by his side, she would become bitter, grow to despise him. He would rather see her dead than have that happen. What I want, she said quietly, seeming to search for the right words. Then she smiled faintly, a smile that almost bordered on sorrowful. I suppose the question is, what do you want to give me? He blinked at her. That was not what he had expected her to say. What he wanted to give her. He raked his brain for a response, but none came forward. Had he ever even allowed himself to consider what he might want to give her? What he could give her? That is irrelevant, he said, hoping but not truly believing that she would accept that as his answer. Surely not, she argued. I would say it is a question of utmost relevance. Especially if we are about to die here together. Do you not owe me this, at the very least? I don't owe you for anything, was his instinctive reaction, but he knew that wasn't quite true. He did owe her, for lying to her, for manipulating her, for causing her to somehow fall in love with him. If nothing else, he owed her for pulling her into all of this from the beginning. But what did she expect? For him to open the floodgates and let uncensored wants and needs rush out freely? Even if he'd wanted to, he'd repressed his own needs for so long that he didn't even know if he could reach them anymore. Constance kept looking at him with her intensely blue eyes, almost as though she could see through his barriers and into his very thoughts. But if he didn't know what he wanted, how could she? When he remained silent, Constance took a small step closer, holding his gaze. Do you perhaps want to tutor me in elder magic? He watched her cautiously, relieved to get an easier question, but still somewhat suspicious of her intentions. I believe my actions speak for themselves in that regard. One corner of her mouth perked up slightly. She took another very small step closer. And do you want to help me overcome my fear of the sun? He nodded slowly. In his mind's eye, he saw the look of terror she had given him the first time he saw her in sunlight. The second time had been painful as well, although admittedly for different reasons. Either way, the answer came easily. I do. She said, tilting her head slightly to the side as she took another step toward him. She was less than 5 feet away now, he had to bend his neck to meet her gaze. Do you find me a pleasant conversational partner? Through letters, or otherwise? Certainly, he said slowly, beginning to suspect where she was going with all of this. A competent dancer, as well? Do you enjoy dancing with me? He thought back to the ball, recalling how easily and smoothly she had followed his lead in their dance as she babbled about her aims and achievements. How determined she had looked when she told him that her magic would change the whole of Fodlan for the better, and that it was up to him whether he wanted her as an ally or not. Despite himself, he felt a smile tug his lips at the memory. I suppose I do. She took another step closer, forcing him to bend his neck even further as she had to bend hers to look up at him. One of her hands reached out toward him, only barely brushing against his chest before it fell to her side again. He held his breath, fighting an impulse to grab her hand and bring it back. Do you want to hold me? She asked quietly. His stomach turned. He should stop her right here. Even if her previous questions could be said to have been rather innocent and easy to answer, this one was towing dangerous territory. But instead of putting a stop to it all, he felt himself reach forward and carefully stroke her left arm, hoping that would suffice as an answer. Her smile trembled somewhat, and then she let out a soft squeak as his hand reached hers and grasped it. Was she nervous? Yes, he forced himself to say, pushing through the nausea to reassure her. She drew in a shaky breath. Then she stepped closer, so close that there was barely any room left between them, and stared into his chest. He expected her to look up at him, but when she didn't, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He raised his free hand and gently gripped her chin between his thumb and forefinger, angling her face up toward him. She gave him a wide-eyed look. He already knew what she would ask next, and still, he didn't do anything to stop her, even though he knew that the moment she asked her question, it would be too late. He wouldn't be able to back out at that point. It was almost ironic how she had used such a basic technique to manipulate him, starting with easy questions, then asking the important ones after he had already conceded the smaller ones, and he'd fallen for it, even while knowing full well what she was doing. Perhaps that meant that he already had the answer to her final question. Do you, she began, trailing off, then drawing for air before continuing. Want to kiss me? Her cheeks colored beautifully as she finished her question, her breath warm on his face. If he'd had a heartbeat, he supposed his heart might have skipped a few of them at this point, but all he could feel was a new kind of lightheadedness. Whether it was the blood loss coming back to claim its price, or the way that Constance was looking at him as though he held the whole world in his palms, he wasn't entirely sure. He glanced down at her lips. Like rose petals. That was the thought he'd had when she'd first shown up earlier. A rose had thorns, ready to sting anyone lured in by its sweet scent. Constance certainly had thorns of her own, but with how earnestly she looked at him now, he couldn't imagine she would sting him if he dared to take the bait. His thumb absent-mindedly stroked her chin, causing her to gasp softly. Her eyes fluttered closed, her lips parting slightly as he lowered his head. It wasn't a question of whether he wanted to, he realized. He wanted it so strongly that he had to actively hold himself back now just so that he could consider the consequences 100th time. 99 times, at least, that he had caught himself wondering what it would be like, whether it would be worth it, how he would go on afterward. Wondering whether he would ever be able to live up to her expectations, because he had never met anyone with as high expectations as Constance had on her peers. Perhaps it still wasn't too late to back down. He could come up with a handful of excuses, none of them good per se, but they would do if he needed them. We need to find a way out of here. You are not thinking clearly right now. We should talk things over before you make a rash decision you might come to regret. This is not what you truly want. I will never be enough for you. Her eyes slowly opened, her gaze studying him. She looked insecure again, and he had a sudden and unwelcome impulse to protect her against whatever might hurt her, even if it was against him. Hubert. He clenched his jaw. Damn these debilitating feelings. She started to pull away. Perhaps we should. Damn them all. His mouth was on hers before she could finish her sentence, the rest of her words turning into a surprised, breathy sound against his lips. The first thought he had after letting his eyes fall closed was that she felt unbelievably soft, her lips felt like they were coated in silk as he closed his mouth around them, and when he gingerly pulled her to him, wanting to feel more of her, he had to hold back a groan at the sensation of her body fitting so perfectly against his. At once, all stress and tension in his muscles simply melted away, his body breathed out in relief, and all that remained was her warmth and her softness. But, he realized as they both stilled, he didn't know where to go from there. For once in his life, he'd chosen to act on impulse without a thought of where it would lead him or how he would continue after the first step. And Constance. Constance seemed frozen, only letting out a tiny little breath as he moved his hand from her chin to the back of her neck. A cold, horrible feeling bloomed in his stomach, and his grip around her faltered. Perhaps he had misinterpreted her. Perhaps she hadn't meant. No, she breathed when he pulled back, and then her hands grabbed hold of his hips, causing him to freeze. Please. He felt her stand on her toes, her neck craning itself further just to reach his lips again. Stumped, he lowered his head to meet her halfway, and she rewarded him with a content hum. A hand snaked its way to the back of his neck, tangling with the shorter curls of hair to be found there. And to his relief, she led him through the kiss this time, urging him to follow along as she parted her lips and grazed his bottom lip with her tongue. A pleasant shiver ran through him. He hadn't misinterpreted her, she did mean it, and she was willing to take the lead in a territory as yet uncharted by him. That thought momentarily made him pause. Was this not uncharted territory for her, then? Who had? The rest of his silent question completely evaporated from his mind as Constance closed her mouth around his bottom lip and began to suck. His hands moved on their own, one of them intertwining its fingers with her hair while the other skirted down her sides until it reached the small of her back, and then he tugged her even closer, impossibly, almost indecently close, but somehow still not close enough. She gasped breathlessly, the most lovely sound he had heard in his life, and pushed herself flat against him, her fingers pressing on the back of his head almost urgently. He complied willingly, leaning into the movement as she pulled him down and tilted his head to the side in order to find a better angle. His remaining blood was quickly rushing from his head, burning his skin like fire. His breaths were coming in short gasps again, but so were hers, and he didn't have the mental capacity to even begin to determine whether the lightheadedness he felt now was a consequence of the blood loss or the fact that Constance had just bit into his lip. He held her firmly against him, fingers tangling fully in her hair as he savored the little whimper she gave when he grazed her lips with his teeth as revenge. Her softness was melting into every single one of his pores, and he didn't think it could possibly feel any better than this until she pushed a leg in between his. The fabric of his pants was so thin that he clearly and immediately felt the warmth of her thigh against his as their hips met. Is this what I have been avoiding like the plague? Is this what I could have had all along? A sound behind her caught his attention even in his compromised state, and before he could even make a conscious decision, his instincts set in and teleported him to the door just before it was pushed open. He caught the intruder by surprise by immediately pulling him into a chokehold. The other man struggled violently, and he quickly realized that he was still much too weak to stand a chance for long. If I'd only had my daggers, he thought with a wince as an elbow just barely missed his ribcage. But then Constance spun around and met his gaze, and after a near-instant moment of silent communication, she fired a well-aimed ice spell right in the face of the struggling intruder. The man's body thudded to the floor, and Hubert shot out a hand to support himself against the open door as he tried to catch his breath. Constance stood frozen where he had left her, staring at him in silent shock as she panted along with him. Her cheeks were bright pink, her hair in disarray, and even from this distance he could see that her lips were slightly swollen. Hubert swallowed, he could still feel the taste of her in his mouth. "Plan or no plan," he said breathlessly, holding the door with a trembling hand. "Time to go." Chapter 22, The Power of the Elders. Keeping his gaze planted on the ground, Yuri carefully padded forward through the spongy moss, making sure to avoid the deceptive little roots and stones sticking out here and there between the trees. He doubted he would find any shoe prints in this dim vegetation, but he refused to miss them if there turned out to be any. They had arrived before sunrise, and the orb of light trembling above his open palm did little to clear the thickness of the dark out in the mountain forests of Hrym, but it was the only way he knew to conjure a consistent light without wasting too much energy, and he would need to conserve his energy for later. Not too far away, he could hear the soft crack of a branch as it broke beneath a boot. That would be Sylvain and Happy. And stumbling around somewhere behind him was Linhard, who seemed too distracted by his own thoughts to evade the roots in the ground. Every few seconds, a surprised gasp could be heard from the man, followed by a displeased mutter about the inconvenience of treading through deep and uncharted forests in the middle of the night. Yuri just sighed to himself as he continued onward, ignoring the white mage's woes. He hadn't exactly chosen to bring Linhard for his excellent navigation skills or his endurance. He'd chosen him because he was simply the most capable healer he knew, and depending on what state Constance and Hubert would be in when they found them, his own powers might not be nearly enough to heal them. Besides, even though Linhard complained right now, his face had lit up at the thought of getting to investigate the hideout of a powerful dark faction of mages. He'd be content as soon as they found what they were looking for, no doubt. That is, if they found what they were looking for. Which was still pretty unlikely, since all they had to go on were the clues he'd pieced together from Constance's notebook and Lady Edelgard's recollection of something Hubert had said about the Hrym territory after the attack on Arianrod. Judging by what Constance had figured out about those who slithered in the dark, their hideout should be somewhere in the mountains, which still left a whole lot of area to cover in a single night. They'd been able to travel quickly with the help of some flying beasts Happy had managed to summon, but after several hours of searching, they were still none the wiser about the location of any kind of secret underground hideout. He couldn't lose hope, though. He was usually cynical realistic about this kind of thing, but this time, he just couldn't. A surprised yell in Happy's voice rang out from his left, causing him to lose his footing and stumble into a tree. Quickly regaining himself, he veered to the side and dashed forward toward the sound. She yelled again, this time in anger. "No! Get away from me, you smelly douchebag!" Even as he ran through the woods, enduring the whipping of branches against his body, he found himself frowning at her word choice. Smelly douchebag? Soon Happy came into his vision, and he drew to a stop. She was standing in a small clearing, holding up a hand in warning which was enveloped by dark magic at something growling at her from the dark. Following her gaze, he saw a pair of glittering eyes near the ground. They seemingly weren't moving closer, but they also didn't turn away and leave. Yuri peered at the wild animal, feeling a surge of exhilaration as he realized what it was. Slowly, careful not to alert the animal, he reached up to grab Happy's arm and lowered it to her side. She gave him a confused look, at which he shook his head. He then took a cautious step toward the wolf before crouching down to its level. "Hey," he said softly. "Figures you'd be here as well. Found anything yet?" Abruptly, the growling stopped. Yuri breathed slow, calm breaths as he waited, hoping Happy would stay still behind him even in her confusion. If he was wrong, this might just be the end of him. But he was pretty sure this was the wolf he'd gifted to Constance all those years back, and if it was, That meant their chances of finding her and Hubert had just skyrocketed. There was a sound of rustling leaves, and then the wolf came forward into the light, walking with its head lowered toward Yuri. He reached out a hand, palm facing upward, and exhaled in relief as the animal cuddled its head against it. With a grin, he started scratching its head and neck, laughing as it whined happily and licked his arm. "Yeah, you recognize me, don't you?" he said as he moved his hands to its belly and scratched vigorously. "You're a good wolf. Best I ever had." Yuri. Happy said behind him. "What the heck is going on?" He turned his head to look up at her, noticing that Sylvain had arrived on the scene as well and was standing beside her with an incredulous look on his face. "It's Constance's wolf," Yuri explained. "Which means it might be able to lead us to her. I know she cast some kind of tracking spell on him, so he could bring." He trailed off. "So he could bring letters to Hubert." Happy and Sylvain still didn't know about Constance's romantic relationship with Hubert, so it might be best to avoid that subject for now. She'd probably like to share that little tidbit herself when the time was right. Happy raised her eyebrows. He smiled. "So he could bring us to her now." He stood up, causing the wolf to do the same, intensely looking up into his eyes with his ice blue gaze. Even if he'd probably preferred it if Yuri had been Hubert, he was clearly relieved to see a familiar face around. "So? Why don't you show us what you've found?" It was a long shot that the wolf would have found something at all. If he had, he probably wouldn't be here now. But after hours of searching without results, they'd run out of other options. Even if the wolf only led them to a dead end, it would still be worth a try. To his surprise, the animal turned around and sprinted in the opposite direction. Throwing caution to the wind, Yuri immediately took off after it, fending off branches as well as he could as he ran almost blindly in the darkness. The orb of light in his hand didn't illuminate nearly enough of his surroundings for this, but he damn well wouldn't lose the wolf now. "Yuri!" Happy shouted behind him. "Follow the light," he yelled back, then immediately realized the wolf might be leading him into a death trap, in which case it wasn't exactly optimal if Happy, Sylvain and Linhard followed him. But they could take care of themselves, they'd know to be careful. Unlike him, who was thoughtlessly sprinting after a wolf through a hazardous and unfamiliar territory, with little light and no knowledge of where the hell he was going to end up. But he could still hear the sound of the wolf running ahead of him. It seemed the animal was keeping a pace that he'd be able to catch up with, which surely must mean that he intended to show him something. He ran at full speed over roots and rocks on the ground, only keeping himself upright with the use of some clever spells along the way to keep from falling on his face or running straight into a tree. In the end, he almost stumbled right over the wolf and slammed into the face of a rock, when the animal came to an abrupt stop by a mountainside with a steep rock wall. Yuri caught himself with one hand against the rock, heart pounding and breath panting as he looked around. No one else in sight, except for a bobbing light some distance away that he assumed was Happy and the others. As he was trying to catch his breath, the wolf walked up beside him, stood up on his hind legs and started scratching fervently against the rock wall. Yuri brought his hand with the light closer, frowning as he examined the surface. "Something about this rock," he mumbled, at which the wolf gave off a low whine and stopped scratching. His large paws were still planted on the rock though, and as Yuri leaned closer, he saw the faint outline of some kind of sigil just above them. It seemed like an etching of an eye, surrounded by two circles in a wreath. He tried to remember whether he'd seen anything like it before, but came up short. The sound of footsteps against gravel told him that the others had caught up. He glanced back over his shoulder, noting with relief that all three of them were there. A part of him had almost been worried Linhard would have gotten lost in the middle of the woods when he left him to run after Happy. "Found something?" Sylvain asked as he walked up next to the wolf, who got down on the ground again and padded back to give the others more space. "Yeah," Yuri said, "though I'm not sure what." "Happy, do you recognize this crest?" At the mention of her name, she came up beside him, leaning in to examine the etching in the rock wall. "I don't think so," she mumbled. "It kinda looks like a dark magic circle, but I don't know about this wreath thingy." She raised a hand to it, following its contours with her finger. "Maybe." With a sudden yelp, she instantly jerked back her hand, holding it to her chest with wide eyes. "Maybe what?" Sylvain asked. "What's wrong?" Happy shook her shoulders as though to rid herself of a shiver. I don't know, my fingertip sort of went through, like it isn't solid rock. Yuri's gaze snapped back to the rock wall. He raised his own hand to the sigil, cautiously placing a palm against it. The rock was cold and slightly uneven against his skin. Even when he tried to press more firmly, all that happened was that the jagged edgings of the etching dug into his palm. He exchanged a glance with Sylvain, who raised his eyebrows as if to say, I don't know either. Hey, Yuri said slowly, turning his gaze to Happy. Give me your hand for a second. After a moment's hesitation, she reluctantly moved her hand from her chest, allowing him to gently grip her wrist. Then he slowly brought her hand toward the rock wall, noting her trembling inhalation when her fingertips touched the material. But unlike his hand, hers continued through the rock when he pushed it forward, disappearing into the dark stone before their eyes. Holy, it's a portal, he breathed, pausing the movement to stare at the half of her hand which was still visible. Or some kind of magical barrier. A barrier only Happy can pass through. For a moment, all three of them just stood there in silence, too shocked to speak. Then Linhard came up behind them, peeking over Happy's shoulder. That's incredible, he said, voice sounding more exhilarated than Yuri had ever heard him before. He reached his own hand forward between them, planting it against the face wall. It only works for you, Happy. Any idea why? It was incredibly brief, but Yuri saw her wince in reaction to the question. She took a deep breath, then shook her head. I think it's the same reason I can summon monsters. Something's definitely wrong with me. Seeing how disturbed she was by that fact, Yuri opened his mouth to comfort her, but Linhard was already speaking again. Keep going, he urged Yuri, apparently ignoring Happy's dejected statement. What happens when your hand touches the rock? The insensitive bastard. On the other hand, they were already short on time. He could have a talk with Happy later, in private. For now, they needed to move forward. He caught her gaze. While there was definitely a spark of terror in her eyes, he thought he could also see determination, as if she was fighting against her own monsters. You okay? She inhaled slowly, then exhaled. Why yeah. Let's do it for Coco. Under her breath, she added, though she really owes me like, 1,000,000 pastries for this. Huffing in amusement at that thought, he gave her what he thought was a reassuring smile, before continuing to push her hand forward through the rock wall. Expecting his fingers to brush against the cold surface of the wall, his heart almost stopped when his hand continued to go through along with her arm. What the? Happy gasped, but the sound was drowned out by a triumphant laugh from Linhard. Fascinating. Some kind of dark magic transferable by contact. Do you think it has anything to do with your crest? If so, this could be a major breakthrough in my research. Just imagine. Linhard, Sylvain said sharply, causing the white mage to fall silent with a huff. Yuri gave Sylvain a grateful look, which he answered with a nod. Pulling Happy's arm out of the rock and releasing her wrist, he sighed deeply as he let his mind run through different alternatives. Part of him had been so convinced they wouldn't find anything that he hadn't really bothered to form a viable plan yet. But now that he knew a bit more, and could assume that Hubert and Constance were in there somewhere, it was time to go into tactics mode. All right. We're going in all at the same time so no one gets stuck out here. We have no clue what awaits us on the other side, so be prepared for battle. Ready? Grab onto Happy and don't let go until you're safely through. Sylvain took Happy's left hand, Yuri her right, and Linhard gripped her left forearm. Catching Happy's gaze again, he gave her a firm nod to reassure her that he had things under control. She replied with a faint smile before turning her gaze straight ahead. On 3, he said. 1, 2. Happy squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. 3. Constance kept her gaze firmly fixed on Hubert's back, holding her breath as she tried to follow him through the shadows along the walls. His movements were quick and smooth, fluid, even in his condition, letting his experience with sneaking through darkness unseen shine through brilliantly. Constance, on the other hand, was wholly unused to this kind of movement. She stumbled after him to her best ability, but she knew that if they were caught before they could reach the exit, it would be because of her. While she had regained some semblance of control over her breathing in the past minutes, her mind had yet to catch up. Part of her was still standing in the little room they had just escaped from, pressed up against Hubert as he kissed her as though their lives depended on it. She could still recall with perfect clarity how it had felt to have his fingers tangled in her hair, his palm warming the small of her back, his mouth decisively moving against hers. She had been so completely engrossed in the incredible feeling of finally getting to see Hubert relinquish his control around her that she hadn't even noticed the door opening. If Hubert hadn't reacted so instinctively to the sound, she might have died in his arms. But instead, thanks to him, they had a chance to escape alive. He seemed to know his way around Shambhala, all the empty back streets and alleys that allowed them to move unseen. And that was a very good thing, considering that it felt like a maze without her lightning magic to guide her. Using simple hand gestures, he communicated his intentions to her in good time before they needed to make a quick turn, wait or speed up across an open area. He had clearly done this kind of thing before, albeit not with her. She had just assumed that he usually went on covered missions on his own, but perhaps she had been mistaken. He was a tactician after all, perhaps he had other people with him more often than not, giving out silent orders to them as they moved through the shadows. Just before a bend in an alleyway, he signaled for her to stop, and then he turned around to face her. "This is too easy," he murmured, gazing down at her. "And the city is too silent. Listen." She did, holding her breath again as she strained her ear to hear something. She hadn't been in Shambhala for long enough to know what sounds used to be there, but she had to admit that their surroundings were eerily silent now. All she could really hear was the buzzing from the blue veins in the walls and floor. "Thales knows." He said it so simply, so undramatically, that she wasn't certain she had heard him correctly at first. She stared up at him, hoping for some kind of hint that she hadn't, but his gaze was deadly serious. "So why is he allowing us to escape?" she whispered. Hubert slowly shook his head, without looking away from her face. "We have not seen the last of him yet." She glanced down his body at the simple shirt and pants. No hidden daggers, and barely any magic reserves left if she were to wager a guess. Otherwise, she had to assume he would just have teleported them out of the city. And herself? She had barely had any sleep. She had nearly exhausted her light magic with her invisibility spell and almost her black magic as well with her lightning, and her experience with elder magic was still negligible. How in the world were they supposed to win a battle against Thales and his army of elder mages? Hubert's expression shifted slightly, making him look somewhat concerned for a second before he smoothed out his features again. "Thales is a capable commander and elder mage, but he tends to overestimate his own greatness and power. He likely believes that he has you under his thumb already. If necessary, you should use that against him. It just might grant us the element of surprise we need. I do not like it, but I'm afraid I would not be of much use in a battle." Constance nodded, clenching her jaw against her discomfort. Thales was manipulative and highly intelligent, and she would have preferred to avoid a confrontation with him altogether. But if it was the only way to escape, the only way to save Hubert's life, she would do whatever it took. He lifted a hand toward her face and paused as if to caress her cheek, then seemed to change his mind and let it fall back to his side. "I trust you," he said quietly. She felt her cheeks warm and her heart skip a beat in her chest. "He trusts me? Even after everything? After all the orders I have disobeyed in the past?" Before she could come up with a suitable response, he had turned around. Already moving forward again, he signaled for her to follow him around the bend. She swallowed, pushing down her emotions for later, and sneaked after him. There was something different in his movements now. He moved faster, with less caution. As though he knew that it wouldn't make a difference. And then, as they neared the next opening between two buildings, he straightened and shifted into a calm stride. Knowingly or not, Hubert had brought them to the main plaza in front of the great chapel. They entered via a side street, coming out right beside one of the two large columns shooting up toward the sky. The plaza was almost completely empty, but for two figures waiting calmly for them in the middle, Thales, dressed in the same extravagant armor as the last time she had seen him, and Faux Hubert, still wearing the original's uniform and cape. At the sight of him, Constance clenched her hands into fists by her sides, before she remembered what Hubert had said, and she forced herself to relax them again. "Let them think they can still convince me to join them. Hubert emanated complete calmness as he strode forward, stopping only about 30 feet from them. She walked up beside him, keeping a close eye on the faux Hubert who had tried to trick her last night. He met her gaze, his lips pulling into an amused smirk as he brought his hands behind his back. She wanted to freeze him over and shatter him to a million pieces for taking a form that wasn't his, for making her believe that he was the one she loved, but she held herself back. For once, she would stand back and watch before she made any decisions. "There you are," Thales said calmly, inclining his head to Constance. "You've wandered quite a bit from your room, Miss Novelli." She glanced at Hubert, uncertain whether she should reply or not. His attention was fixed on Thales. "It's not too late to save this," he called. "You still need us, and we need you. If you let us go, we will not tell a soul about what transpired here. Lady Edelgard will be none the wiser." So this was his plan, she thought as she watched him from the corner of her eye, to bargain for their freedom. She turned her gaze back to Thales and the man standing by his side. The former now moved his gaze to Hubert, but the latter still had his full attention on Constance. She tried not to let it get to her, but she was incredibly uncomfortable about seeing him again, now that she knew what he was. Or rather, what he was not. "Ah," Thales said, "but you have missed a vital detail, my boy." He raised his hand, gesturing broadly to faux Hubert. "You may need us, but we do not need you. At least not you personally." At that, faux Hubert took a step forward, lifted his arm to his chest and bowed deeply. "I will do whatever Her Majesty requires of me." The familiarity in both the voice and the sentiment chilled Constance to the bone, and judging by Hubert's silence as he fixed the man with his gaze, they seemed to be thinking along the same lines. Whoever this man was, he would doubtlessly be able to trick Lady Edelgard into thinking he was the real thing. As he straightened, the man met her gaze with a smug smile. "It is a pleasure seeing you again, Constance. We had such a lovely conversation yesterday, didn't we?" Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Hubert clench his jaw. Forcing a smile, she opted to stay silent, not trusting herself to be able to keep her voice steady if she were to talk. "A pity you were too tired to continue. But it's not too late, you know." He took a calm step forward, lowering his head slightly to meet her gaze straight on. "We all know why you are really here, why you set your sights on the right hand of the Adrestian Empress. You want power, and marrying into the Empress' inner circle will grant you just that. There's no way you would fall for someone so stern, cold and grey otherwise. You are the bright and colorful Constance von Novelli, a creative and sociable noblewoman with enough ambition to last an entire army. Why would you risk being held back by the unsympathetic Hubert von Vestra? Enough ambition to last an entire army." She immediately recognized the phrase. It was the same that Lord Arundel had used to lure her into coming with him to Shambhala. Was this man simply parroting Thales? She glanced at Hubert, wanting to catch his reaction. He looked disgusted, almost sick as he listened to the words coming out of his reflection's mouth. "Do not believe a word he says," she wanted to tell him. "That is not why I have fallen in love with you. You know that, don't you?" But outwardly, she needed to play into Thales' hands. She needed to pretend to be swayed. So she looked back at faux Hubert, adopting a wide-eyed stare as though in awe of what he was saying. "If it is power you want," he continued steadily, "then joining me is your best bet. You will still be part of the inner circle, but you will also have all of our technology at your fingertips. And I promise you," he added in a somewhat lower voice, his smile turning almost predatory, "I have all the charm the original Hubert lacks, and none of his flaws. With me as your lover, you will have all the romance and excitement that you could ever wish for." Beside her, Hubert made a disgruntled sound. Constance swallowed down her anger as she cast down her eyes to collect herself. How could this man say such horrible, disgusting things to her? How could he believe for even a second that he knew what she wanted and wished for? To be sure, she always strived to develop and gain more power, but not at this cost. And this was not why she had fallen in love with Hubert. She had fallen in love with Hubert because of who he was as a person, the Hubert who had shown his true colors in the margins of library books and in letters exchanged over a 5-year-long war. The Hubert who hadn't dared to tell her about his true identity because he was afraid she might no longer want him when she learned the truth. The Hubert who had silently and secretly veiled the sun from her view to shield her from its debilitating light. The Hubert who had told her he would sink all of Garreg Mach into the ocean if anything happened to her while he was away. She had fallen in love with the Hubert who had tutored her, guided her, helped her both from the shadows and in the light. She had fallen in love with the Hubert who had repeatedly told her that he would kill her if she disobeyed another one of his direct orders, but who somehow always got himself out of his own promise every single time. She had fallen in love with the Hubert who kissed her as though nothing else existed but her, and who only broke away from the kiss in order to save her life. And now, this impostor was trying to argue that the only reason that she had chosen Hubert was so that she could be more powerful. For such an outrageous claim, he deserved nothing but suffering. But first, she needed to get him to change shape. She could not endure seeing him wear Hubert's face for any longer. Drawing in a shaky breath, she stepped forward with a hand tightly clenched over her heart. If I am to become your lover, I believe I deserve to know your true name and face. The man exchanged a glance with Thales, who to her great relief inclined his head in silent permission. Turning his gaze back to Constance, Faux Hubert smiled and bowed again. I suppose I do owe you that. As he straightened, he circled his hand in the air, causing an elder magic circle to appear below his feet. Dark dust sparked out of nothing and enveloped him, and when it faded again, a new man stood in his place. As tall as Hubert but with hair as blonde as Lady Edelgard's, the man was dressed more like a traditional assassin than as any of the other elder mages she had seen so far, although his garments followed the same color patterns as that of Thales: black, violet, dark red and gold, and the same sigil as the one she had seen on the floor of the chapel shone in gold on his chest. 2 daggers glimpsed on either side of his body, tucked into a red belt by his waist, but she had to assume there were more of them in his sleeves, boots, and other hidden compartments. Raising her gaze to his face, she had to cover her mouth before a gasp slipped out. His eyes were completely black, void of any white whatsoever, and a black cross had been inked straight across his right eyelid. The front strands of his wavy, shoulder-length hair were tied back into a bun on the back of his head. His features were sharp and precise, and if she hadn't already hated him with all of her heart, she might have found him attractive. But now, she only saw repugnant ruthlessness and apathy in his expression. He shot out his right arm straight to his side, causing his cape to flutter with a dramatic flourish. He was still smiling, but now that he wasn't wearing Hubert's face anymore, it didn't make her quite as uncomfortable. Now she at least knew him for what he truly was. My name, he said in a smooth voice, is Lysias. He extended a hand gloved in black to her from across the plaza, a silent invitation. And my offer still stands. Come with me, and I will help you reach your full potential. Your power will be limitless. Something about his new voice was strangely calming, and she found herself staring into the blackness of his eyes almost mindlessly as he spoke to her. Limitless. The word echoed through the chambers of her mind. This wasn't the first time he had said that word in regards to her future. Lysias beckoned her forward with his hand, and she took a hesitant step toward him, swaying slightly on her feet. His night black eyes sucked her in, causing her to fumble after what she had been thinking a moment ago. Lysias. He hasn't done anything to hurt me yet. He has only been kind, only promised me wonderful things. Perhaps he can be trusted? Constance, Hubert's sharp voice called from behind. A hand gripped her wrist. She froze in her next step, looking over her shoulder. His expression was firm and decisive as he caught her gaze. He is trying to hex you. Do not look into his eyes. She frowned, trying to think. She recognized this feeling from last night, when Lysias had bid her good night by her bedroom door. This, brain fog. A heavy weariness coming out of nowhere. Lysias scoffed somewhere nearby, and then she felt a hand on her shoulder. She spun around, immediately finding herself face to face with him again. He smiled gently as his other hand moved to her waist, tugging her closer to him and away from Hubert. Hex you? Now why would I do that? You are intelligent enough to know what's best for you, and your brightest future is right here, by my side. He leaned in to whisper in her ear, by Lady Edelgard's side. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly as she considered his words. Lady Edelgard. That was where she wanted to be. But something was scratching at the edge of her attention, and that something made her pause as she once again tried to push through the fog. "Is this what you're planning to do?" Hubert's voice asked, sounding unreal and far away. "Hex her into obedience? Eventually, you will run out of energy, and she will know what you have done. I almost pity you for what she will do to you then." Lysias sighed above her. "Thales," he said. "This pathetic creature is annoying me. Can we put it out of its misery?" Somewhere to her right, Thales spoke up. "Indeed. We have enough blood now. All that remains is the extraction of the crest stone." "Perfect." Lysias moved his hands to her shoulders, and then he turned her around so that she faced the other direction. "You should see this, love. I think you'll enjoy it." His hands clamping down around her, locking her in place against him, she watched calmly as Hubert, eyes wide, one foot taking a step back, was joined by Thales, who had teleported himself to his side. Hubert raised a hand, supposedly trying to cast a spell of his own, but Thales easily gripped his wrist, and the magic died out before it could even spark to life. "Constance," he called behind gritted teeth. "You are stronger than this. Snap out of it." "Snap out of what?" she thought as Thales' other hand grabbed hold of Hubert's throat. And why would she even listen to him? He had only been a pawn, a tool to get where she wanted to be, right here by Lysias' side. "Let me tell you a little secret," Lysias whispered, having leaned in toward her ear. She hummed softly at the warmth of his breath against her skin. "The stone in his chest? It's the first step of granting you more power. You see," he said, pausing to exhale in amusement, "inside his chest is the Noah Crest Stone, which we will use to power your very own relic." The Noah Crest Stone. Inside Hubert's chest? He'd told her Thales had implanted a crest stone in him as part of the Elder ritual, but he had never mentioned which crest stone. Did he even know? Thales released his wrist and instead pressed that hand against his chest. Hubert yelled out in pain, before forming his lips into the shape of a name one last time. "Sunshine," he choked out. Something pounded in her chest. Constance gasped, clutching at her heart. Sunshine. Sunshine. Yes, that was her, and that was his pet name for her, that he'd used in every single letter he'd sent to her over the years. The pet name that was ironically dark for her, even bordering on cruel, but that had quickly made its way into her heart simply because it was a name that he had given to her. Feeling the fog in her mind lift somewhat, she screamed out at the gruesome scene in front of her. Hubert, face contorted in pain as Thales' hand slowly sank into his chest, and standing on his feet only because Thales was still holding him by the throat. Before she could even form a coherent rational thought, she reached for her lightning magic, sending the strongest and most powerful bolt she could muster toward Thales. The magic hit him right in his back, and with a grunt, he let go of Hubert and staggered back as though he'd been burned. Hubert crumpled to the ground at the same time as Constance tore out of Lysia's grip, blindly sending another bolt in his direction but not bothering to turn around and see if it hit. She ran over to Hubert, quickly moving her hand in an arch above her and mumbling prayers to create a light shield around them as she crouched by his side. She must have stopped Thales just in time, because when she hastily examined his chest, all she could see was a small area of charred skin right in the middle. He blinked up at her, breathing erratically. "Hubert. Are you?" He swallowed, then pushed himself up into a seated position with gritted teeth. "Don't lose focus," he panted. "Look behind you." She turned her head to follow his gaze. She heard the rumble in the distance even before she saw them, two enormous, mechanical figures, armed with hefty shields and blades, and heading in their direction from two wide side streets. Constance fell back on her palms in shock, staring at them as they made their way onto the plaza. Those had to be 40 feet tall at the very least, and they moved on their own from some kind of invisible power. What are Titanus?" Hubert said in a low voice, pausing to cough before he continued. "A mechanical warrior created with Agarthan technology. They are incredibly strong and durable, especially against ordinary weapons." "What about magic?" she asked, looking around for an escape route even as the large figures closed in on them. Would the warriors destroy the city in order to find and eradicate them, or could the side streets be an option? But perhaps Hubert was not in any condition to walk on his own. She might have to cast a spell to transport him, leaving her completely defenseless. Magic, Hubert breathed with a pained expression on his face, is their weakness. Perfect if only she hadn't already depleted most of her energy thus far. She still had some strength left, but if she wanted to get Hubert out, she might have to prioritize. Lysias appeared right in front of their shield, arms crossed and expression dark. She jerked in surprise, grasping for Hubert's arm. "Please, dear goddess, let the shield hold." Lysias placed a palm against its surface, huffing as light gathered beneath it to keep him out. "So even down here, the false gods can hear your pleas." Moving his hand in front of his chest instead, he flexed his fingers as if preparing a spell. "Let's see how well your faith can withstand the pure power of the elders." A violet magic circle glowing beneath his feet, he closed his hand into a fist, and the veil cracked in a million pieces and scattered around them with a loud whooshing sound. Constance threw out a hand, already channeling her lightning magic, but before she could form a spell, something crashed into him from the side and sent him flying into the nearest pillar. Constance took the opportunity to push herself to her feet, immediately spinning toward the source of the attack. She nearly fainted at the very sight. Just a few paces away stood Yuri, one hand holding a sword, the other raised in the aftermath of a light spell. His otherwise perfectly sculpted hair was wind-blown and moist, his face was covered in tiny scratch marks, and his chest was heaving. If it hadn't been for his disheveled appearance, she might have thought he was just a figment of her imagination, but then their gazes met, and he gave her a strange kind of smile that almost bordered on fearful, and something in his expression pierced through her shock. "Yuri," she exclaimed, wanting to run up to him and throw her arms around him, but stopping herself as she remembered they were in the midst of battle. His smile grew, then wavered slightly. "And friends," he said, inclining his head to his left. She turned her head in that direction just as Happy, Sylvain and Linhard appeared from a side street. She watched in stunned silence as the two former immediately threw themselves into the battle, Happy casting an elder spell at Lysias as he tried to stalk back toward them and Sylvain backing her up with fire. Linhard ran up to Hubert, crouching by his side and holding out his hands over his body. She wanted to fall to her knees and cry in relief, perhaps even thank the goddess, but Yuri had just thrown himself into battle with the nearest Titaness, and she realized with a pang of concern that she had no idea where Thales was. She spun to face the two mages on the ground. Hubert had his eyes closed, wincing as Linhard's hands hovered just above his heart. As she watched, she saw the blackened skin on his chest heal into fresh tissue. "His blood," she called. "He has lost a good amount of it." "Can you?" "Maybe," Linhard said in a clipped voice, making it clear that he did not want to be disturbed. Fine by her, Hubert could hardly be in better hands at the moment. Turning back to the battle, she quickly determined that Sylvain and Happy seemed to be holding their own against Lysias, at least keeping him at bay for the time being. Yuri was zipping between the two Titaness, deftly evading their attacks and shooting little bursts of light magic in their direction whenever he could. He was a skilled tactician, a capable duelist and a quick-footed thief, but his magic was not one of his strengths. If Hubert was right that magic was the Titaness' weakness, she needed to assist him. She would never be able to evade their attacks in the way that he did. It looked easy when he did it, but she knew better than to underestimate his agility. But if he distracted them, she might be able to attack them from a distance. They only needed to weaken the Titaness enough to allow the six of them a chance to escape, so hopefully her magic reserves should hold for that. She was just about to call on her magic when a humming sound growing in strength nearby caught her attention. The veins running along the tall pillars in front of the chapel were glowing brighter than any of its surroundings, and as she lifted her gaze, she saw the air flicker with energy around the spikes at the top of the pillars. The spikes that had made her wonder whether those pillars were some kind of weapon, but that she had soon forgotten about in the wake of everything else that had been going on. She stared up at the building energy, momentarily enchanted by the beauty of it and how it reminded her of her own lightning magic. Then all of that energy released all at once, shooting a beam of crackling light straight in her direction. She had just enough presence of mind to throw up a barrier around her, but it only took the brunt of the force. The strange light pierced through her barrier and hit her in the stomach, knocking the air out of her and sending her stumbling back. She gasped for breath, bending over double. Stars danced in front of her eyes. Beams of light. Agarthan weapons. She would bet her right foot that Thales was controlling them. That must be where he had disappeared to. Yuri Bird. She immediately snapped her head in the direction of Happy's horrified voice, then toward where she had last seen Yuri. He was near one of the Titaness, scrambling to get up on his feet where he had fallen to the floor. The Titaness was just turning toward him and raising its sword. He must have been hit by the attack from the second pillar. Without a magical shield to blunt the force, it was a miracle he was even conscious. And now, he was about to be speared by an enormous, mechanical doll. But not if she could do something about it first. Extending her arms to her sides, she bent her neck back and closed her eyes, calling on her lightning magic. She'd intended on sending down a powerful bolt of lightning onto the Titaness, however, she had forgotten one vital thing. As soon as the magic came to her, she recognized the by now familiar feeling of having the entirety of Shamhala's network at her fingertips. With a gasp, she realized that she could sense not only the Titaness themselves, they must somehow be connected to the magical veins, but also the weapon used to fire the magical pillar weapons. And her senses told her that the weapon was being controlled from within the chapel. The etching at the top of the stairs. At first seeing it, she had suspected from Thales' words and actions that it was some kind of conduit for casting stronger elder spells. Could it be the interface used by Thales to fire the two pillars? And if so, could it be used for other attacks as well? Such as the pillars of light that destroyed Aryan Rod. As these thoughts rushed through her mind, she also realized that if the Titaness were connected to the blue web of veins, then that might mean that she could control them. Just like she had once managed to control a rat with lightning magic. And if that was true, she needn't destroy them, instead, she could order them to stand back and let them go. Or even better, she could command them to destroy the chapel, with Thales, and the magical etching in it. However, she could already feel her powers betraying her. She tried to push through the network as she had done before in order to create a distraction, but her reserves were running dry. She had nothing left to draw from. As soon as his eyes landed on her, Hubert knew what was happening. Well, he didn't know exactly what she was trying to do, but he could see what was stopping her. Her head leaned back, arms extending from her body, and chest heaving, her hands trembling as faint sparks climbed up her arms, refusing to ignite into a spell. Whatever she was trying to do, she did not have the magical energy for it. Pushing aside Linhard, who made an affronted sound in response, he got to his feet with some effort, then stumbled forward. His head swam, warning him that he was still much too weak to fight. But that was all right. He did not intend to fight this time. Coming up behind Constance, he reached out to grasp both of her wrists in his hands. She let out a surprised gasp, at which he leaned in toward her ear. In order to reach her wrists, he had to stand so close to her he could almost feel her tremble against him. "My power is yours," he murmured. Then he channeled the Elder Sharing spell. As he felt his own reserves empty and struggled against the weariness that was usually so easy to fight, but that now in his already weakened state seemed almost overpowering, Constance's hands began to glow with pure power. "Hubert," she gasped. "Stop. You will kill yourself. Better act quick, then," he whispered. To his relief, she stopped trying to fight him and his power, choosing instead to welcome and embrace it into her own reserves. With an exhausted sigh, he closed his eyes and bent his neck forward, leaning the side of his head against hers. The power thrummed in her body, and he almost thought he could feel the magic work inside of her as she cast the intended spell. He tried to focus on his own breathing and the scent of her hair to keep himself alert, knowing that if he allowed himself to slip away and ended up releasing her wrists, she might not be able to finish what she had started. Only when he heard surprised yells from the others, followed by a hard crashing sound, did he lift his head and look out over the plaza again. What met him was unlike anything he could have imagined. The two Titaness had turned their backs on them and chosen to attack the chapel instead. As they swung their weapons against the building, large chunks of stone cracked from the walls and whacked into the floor below, crushing anyone who happened to run by right at that moment. Yuri was on the floor behind the giants, propped up on his elbows and struggling to get up on his feet as he watched them demolish the chapel. Hubert exhaled in disbelief. "Constance," he breathed. "You." He hesitated. Telling her that she was controlling two enormously powerful machines seemed like stating the obvious. but what he was seeing was far from anything he could have ever expected. "You are incredible," he said instead, and in response, she drew for air. "I am going to destroy this city," she replied in a voice strained by exertion. "I have access to the pillars of light, Hubert. I will launch them straight into Shambhala. Thales will never be able to attempt anything against us again." He stared at the chapel, crumbling to pieces before their eyes as she spoke. "The pillars of light? She could control them and from a distance. I believe we will have enough time to escape after the weapon is fired," she continued. "Can you get us out? You, me, and the others." He made a quick calculation in his head, letting his gaze move from Yuri by the Titaness, to Happy and Sylvain still struggling against Lysias, to Linhard who cast healing spells from the sidelines. He would not be able to get even himself and Constance out with the little power he would doubtlessly be left with after she was finished with her spells, but if he could borrow energy from one of the other mages, he might be able to teleport them all out of there. He should be able to teleport them all out of there, if he could get his hands on at least one of them, and if that person had enough energy left to spare. Linhard was the closest one by far, so it would have to be him. "I believe so," he said. She nodded, then inhaled and exhaled deeply. "Good." Once again, he felt his own power flow into her and thrum through her body. But this time, he watched with his eyes open as she cast her spell. The first thing he noticed was how the light in the webbing of blue-green lines in the floor around them pulsated, then exploded into a brightness so sharp he had to look away for a moment. When he looked back at the chapel, the lines on the remaining walls and on the floor glowed almost as brightly as around them, the light moving in a rapid pace into the chapel and toward the sigil at the top of the staircase. Is this elder magic? Or some kind of black magic? Even with his magic reserves at her fingertips, she should not be this powerful, especially not in a magical art that she had only barely scratched the surface of, and without going through any kind of elder ritual. No, this must not be elder magic. So what was it then? Some kind of light spell. But why would that have any effect on machinery? There was no sign that she had succeeded in her task, other than the fact that he could feel her relax her muscles, then lower her arms to her sides. He released her wrists, feeling the little power that remained flowing back into his body. It was then, just as he was about to call for Linhard, that the horrific thing that couldn't be allowed to happen occurred, right before his eyes. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Lysias extend an arm toward them, and in the next second, an elder spell shot out of his hand. Sylvain threw himself into the mage to get him off his balance, but it was already too late. Even before the spell hit its mark, Hubert could see what it was, a curse. The worst kind of elder magic. Without his usual strength and reflexes, there was no way he could react in time. Instead, he had to helplessly watch as the curse landed, striking Constance in the chest like an arrow. She stumbled back into him, legs giving in beneath her. But he could still feel her pulse, her warmth, her breath on his cheek as he leaned forward over her shoulder. Whatever the curse had done, it had left her alive at least. There was no time to think any further than that. "Linhard," he yelled. "To me, now." The white mage knew better than to argue at this point, running straight toward them. He had probably seen the curse hit as well and was expecting an order to heal her, but that would have to wait another moment. As soon as Linhard arrived by their side, Hubert violently grabbed his wrist and wasted no time in pulling from his reserves. As the magic streamed into him like a powerful torrent, he raised his other hand and began a teleportation spell, quickly identifying the other figures he wanted to bring with him. Yuri, Sylvain, Happy. The second he had them in his mental grasp, he swiped his hand to the side, enveloping himself in a familiar cloud of dark dust. As his vision faded to black, he focused his mind on where he wanted to take them. Outside. Dark, cold, crisp. As far away as possible. When his vision returned, he was standing in a forest, completely drenched in darkness. Before even thinking of casting a fire spell to light their surroundings, he brought Linhard's hand to Constance's chest. "Heal her," he commanded. I don't know if I." "Heal her," he repeated. "I don't care if you know how, just do it." He knew he wasn't making much sense, but the terror of possibly losing her to a curse now, after everything they had gone through together, after everything. "Hubert," Constance murmured, gripping his hand and squeezing it. Hubert, please, I am well. I am merely exhausted after using such powerful magic. What? She had been struck by a curse, and claimed to be well? You do not grasp the gravity of... His next words died on his tongue as a burst of light crackled above their heads. He turned his gaze to the sky, watching as pillars of light rained down upon the ground in the distance. Thankfully, he had managed to muster the power and presence of mind to teleport them far enough away that they should not be seriously harmed by the attack. The city of Shamhala, however. Well, if the ground did not collapse in onto the city and crush it beneath the heavy rocks of the mountainside, he would be extremely surprised. From here, however, all they heard from the destruction were distant explosions as pillar after pillar struck the ground, lighting up even their little clearing in the forest in their wake. Hubert quickly looked around and saw Happy, Sylvain and Yuri nearby. Good. That meant that he had managed to save all of them. Her head hanging, Constance silently turned to face him, wrapping her arms around his torso and burying her face in his chest. At first, he was uncertain how to react, particularly with all of the others around to see. But they all had their gazes fixed on the horizon, watching the fireworks so to speak, so he allowed himself to hold her in his arms. Only after he'd closed his arms around her did he realize that her shoulders were shaking. Was she crying? Sunshine, he whispered as he carefully stroked her back, recalling the last time that she had cried in his arms, which had also happened to be the first. It was after he had hidden the sun from her view. He hadn't expected it then, and he most certainly hadn't expected it to happen a second time. Instead of pushing her again when she didn't reply, he decided just to hold her for now. Perhaps it was simply weariness, or perhaps the magnitude of everything that had happened in the past 24 hours had finally caught up with her. Either way, there would be time to talk about it at a later date. The pillars of light stopped coming eventually, leaving only a faint outline of smoke in the distance. Yuri channeled a light spell in his palm then, illuminating their clearing once again. His gaze moved to Constance, causing Hubert to freeze, but the rogue paused there for only a moment before moving over to Happy and Sylvain. The latter had pulled the former to his side, one arm wrapped around her shoulders. They looked mostly unharmed except for a few scratches on their faces and tears in their clothes. Yuri, however, looked the most worn out of all of them, which was not too strange considering that he had been hit by a powerful elder weapon just moments earlier. Happy, Yuri said tiredly, leaning against a nearby tree. Will you be a darling and summon our rides home? It seemed like a strange thing to say, but with how tired Hubert was himself, he didn't have the energy to ponder on it. Even when large, winged beasts showed up, he managed to swallow his discomfort with flying and climb atop the things. Happy assured them that she knew how to control the animals, which was also beyond him in his present state, but with his arms locked around Constance, who was an expert at riding winged animals, he somehow still managed to endure the ride all the way back to Garreg Mach. At least, after all had been said and done, he was alive, Constance was alive, and there would be no impostor by Lady Edelgard's side. Despite the fact that Constance had gone against his wishes yet again, he supposed he had to count tonight as a success. Chapter 23, Two Kinds of Threats. Hubert ran his hand along the motley row of books, scrolls, and haphazard pieces of parchment stuck in between. Wheat recipes, the art of saddling a horse, a collection of letters between an ancient king and his lover, a list of practical jokes. What an absolutely disorderly collection of resources. If he hadn't been so dejected by what had met him in the Shadow Library so far, he might have found it a practical joke in itself. How in the world was he supposed to find anything of value in this chaotic place? Aren't you supposed to be snoring in a sick bed right now? He paused with his hand by the next shelf, turning his head just enough that he could see the visitor from the edge of his cowl. As he caught sight of Yuri, he sighed and ran a hand over his head to remove the cowl, then watched as the other man crouched down next to Crow and vigorously scratched his neck. The wolf leaned his head back and let out a content whine. I suppose if you ask Linhard, Hubert said wearily, then yes, I should. But I believe I know my own limits best. He watched with dismay as Crow flopped onto his side and rolled over to reveal his stomach, at which Yuri laughed and moved his attention to the new area. Apparently Yuri was the only one other than Hubert and Constance who could even get close to the animal without a low growl in response. Come to think of it, hadn't Constance once mentioned he was the one who gifted it to her to begin with? He turned his disapproving gaze to the wolf, before catching himself and immediately turning to the bookshelves instead. What am I even doing? He's just a wild animal. There is no such thing as betrayal in his world. Fair enough, Yuri replied as he stood again, brushing loose strands of fur off his pants as Hubert continued to browse the goods. I guess I'm one to talk. I narrowly avoided the infirmary myself. He started walking along the row of shelves, letting his fingers graze against the backs of the books held within as he passed them by. You know, if you're looking for something in particular, you should ask Constance. She's spent so long searching through these shelves, I bet she practically knows them by heart at this point. And the goddess knows we would need an actual librarian down here. Rare pearls mixed in with centuries of junk. He stopped next to Hubert, with his gaze roaming the shelves in front of them. Then again, I guess that's part of the experience. The thrill of the hunt. Hubert scoffed. And you're here for the thrill, I assume. Me? I just came to say hi, Yuri said with a sideways smirk. You didn't think you could hide from me in my own home, did you? I was informed the minute you stepped into Abyss. His smirk widened into a grin, his head tilting back somewhat as he continued in a playful lilt, and yeah, that means I know you were here in disguise that time in the inn as well. Only, I didn't know back then that you were her crow. If I had, maybe I'd have let Constance know that her secret lover was spying on her. Hubert clenched his jaw. He knew Yuri's type, knew that he wanted to get a rise out of him, but Hubert would not give him that satisfaction. Instead, he decided to change the subject. I believe I haven't had the chance to express my gratitude, he said calmly as he turned to the trickster, whose grin instantly faded. You were instrumental in our escape from Shamhala. Without you, it is very likely we would not have made it out alive, if at all. Yuri shrugged as he picked out a book seemingly at random and began to browse through it. From what he could tell, it was a botanical study. I was just a distraction. Constance handled the rest. Hubert studied the other man as he nonchalantly flipped through the book. He radiated calmness, a man in control of his surroundings, who was right where he wanted to be and knew just how to navigate his way around their conversation, but Hubert could sense something else just beneath the surface. Something he was trying to hide, to push down. Usually, that was a sign that lies were being told, but that didn't seem to be the case here. Clearly, it was too early to push him at this moment. He needed more leverage first, some kind of opening. And in order to find one, he might have to give a peace offering. I'm searching for resources on dark magic, he said. More specifically, curses. Without ceasing his browsing, Yuri glanced up at him with feigned disinterest. And here I thought you already knew all there was to know about dark magic. Hubert let out a mildly amused huff. Flattering, but no. I have never had cause to research curses before, and there is so little written on the subject that I have only stumbled upon tidbits here and there. And now you're trying to dig up what you can find, because you think Constance was struck by a curse. That right? I don't just think, I know she was, Hubert said, unable to keep the annoyance out of his voice. And until I have learned of a way to remove the curse, whatever its nature, she will need to be kept under surveillance. Yuri's fingers abruptly stopped flipping through the pages. Finally, a reaction, although it was unclear exactly what he was thinking. He stared straight down at the book for a moment, inhaling and then exhaling slowly. Have you told her yet? No, Hubert replied. She is still asleep in the infirmary. He slowly started browsing through the book again. She won't like it. Hubert smiled grimly, turning to face the shelves in front of him. His gaze scanned the one right above his eye level. Of the titles that were visible without having to pull anything out from the shelf, none seemed relevant to his search. No. She will not. His gaze paused as he reached the end of the shelf, and his own words slowly sank in. She will not like it, nothing will change that. But perhaps there was a way to at least mitigate the violation somewhat. On that note, he began, I'm leaving for the kingdom tomorrow, which means I will have to task one of my men with said surveillance. Unless you would be willing to keep an eye on her, that is. Once again, Yuri's fingers stilled. But this time, he closed the book and smoothed it over the front with one hand before speaking. If that's what she prefers. Of course. It is up to her what she wants. I assume you are going to ask her, then. Go visit when she wakes up. Hubert looked back at the shelf. He reached up to pull out a book with a titleless back, then put it back when he saw that it concerned the history of axes. He knew that he should visit her, knew that Constance would be expecting it. She would likely be confused that he was not there when she woke up. But there was little time left to handle what he needed to do in the remaining time before his next mission, and seeing Constance. It was not that he was afraid. Of course he wasn't, he wouldn't be of such a simple, harmless thing. But I'll see what I can do, he said. I have to prepare for tomorrow's journey. I've already lost several days. Of course. There was that something bubbling beneath the surface again. It was in his tone of voice, in the way he held himself, in his gaze whenever he stole a glance in Hubert's direction. While it was a little clearer now, there was obviously contempt leaking through in his responses. He couldn't see Yuri cracking in the near future unless he was pushed far enough. And Hubert was too short on time to afford playing around. Sighing, he turned to the other man. You clearly have something you wish to say. Why don't you spare us both some time and spit it out, whatever it is? With that, Yuri put his book back on the shelf and turned to face him with a resolute expression. Fine, he said in a clipped voice. Then let me be frank. I don't like you, and I don't trust you. But for some reason that is beyond me, Constance has fallen in love with you. And from what I gather, the feeling seems to be mutual. So I seem to be stuck with you for now. Hubert crossed his arms over his chest. Finally, some sincerity. He wasn't surprised Yuri didn't like him, he couldn't exactly say he liked him either. But he did know that Constance considered him a dear friend, and so he had no choice but to respect the man's opinion whether he wanted to or not. Yes, I believe I'm in a similar predicament, he said dryly. Yuri let out an amused huff, yet his expression remained wholly unamused. Now, I don't presume to know better than Constance what she wants or needs. I believe she's capable of deciding that for herself. He shook his head. But for fuck's sake, man, how many times are you going to keep screwing this up? Only the many years of practicing discipline over his own expression and body language saved him from making a complete fool of himself in that moment. He swiftly turned his head back to the shelf, sorely needing the breathing room away from Yuri's gaze, but he regretted it as soon as he broke eye contact. Don't show weakness, you fool. Listen, Yuri continued. You fuck up again and again and never seem to learn. If Constance thinks she can be happy with you, then I don't mind giving her a push in the right direction when she needs it. But there's only so far I'll go to maintain a relationship I'm not even part of, and you're towing dangerously close to the line. Hubert swallowed thickly, staring at the unhelpful backside of a children's book on the nearest shelf. He felt as though he'd been thrown over a cliffside and was plunging to his death. A push in the right direction. Was he implying that he had helped convince Constance to keep trying with him? Was that why she had so stubbornly pushed onward even when he kept brushing her off? He'd wondered about that, why she never seemed to back down, even after he'd explicitly told her he could never give her what she wanted. Constance is in love with you, Yuri said sharply, clearly growing agitated by Hubert's silence. Constance von fucking Novelli. She's in love with you, man. He slammed the side of his fist into a shelf, causing a few loose scrolls to jump off the edge and fall to the floor. And you're throwing it away, over and over and over again. Do you think you're the only one who sees her for what she is? Do you think you're the only one who lifts off the ground when she laughs and aches to protect her when she cries? Well, sorry to kiss your fairytale goodbye, but you're not alone. Hubert clenched his fists behind his back. He had expected some harsh words, perhaps a thinly veiled warning at the most, but he was not at all prepared for this. This was. Yes. He knew that she was in love with him, and he knew that he was fucking it up repeatedly. Why? He wished he knew. He did love her, and apparently, he was not the only one. How did I miss this? Next time I find her crying because of you, Don't expect me to sing your praises. Next time, I swear I'll put all my cards on the table and show her what she could have instead. Do you want to take that chance? Are you confident she'd still choose you? Because if not, you better fucking get your head out of your ass and prove to her that you're worth her time and attention, or you might end up losing her to someone who will. At this point, Yuri's eyes were glowing with rage. Considering that, his voice was downright calm, throughout his monologue, he had barely even raised it. Have I made myself clear? Hubert took a deep breath through gritted teeth. Clear? Yes. It was highly, undeniably clear that he had underestimated Constance's relationship with Yuri. He'd been able to surmise from what she'd said in her letters that the two were close, but now he couldn't help wondering whether she'd only told a half-truth. Of course, she didn't owe him any truths at all about previous relationships, but judging by how adamant Yuri was concerning this matter, it was unlikely that his was just a passing fancy. And if there had already existed something between the two of them, however brief or shallow, it could always spark again. So, yes. He had made himself clear. He turned his head to look at Yuri, who raised his eyebrows in an impatient question. Yes, he said in a low voice. Extremely clear. Yuri smirked then, but it was a twisted, almost disgusted kind of smirk. I would say good, but to be frank, I kinda hope you'll fail again. You should be grateful that I'm even giving you this last chance. With that, he spun on his heel and strode out of the library, muttering curse words below his breath. Hubert was left staring at the shelf right in front of him, practically paralyzed in place. This last chance. Which he took to mean that if he left for Fairgus without seeing Constance again, he might return to find her in someone else's arms. And perhaps that might be for the best, especially for her. But was their relationship, or whatever it could be called, that weak? Or had he simply taken too many twists and turns to reach this point, that any mistake on his part would be the last straw? And most importantly, was he willing to risk it? Truth be told, she could be a damn nuisance when she wanted to, especially when she refused time and time again to comply with his orders. But more often than not, she was somehow a pleasant nuisance. An image of Constance, telling him with a sweetly malicious smile that, "You look like you could need a nap, my lord," popped up unbidden in his mind, followed by an image of her dressed in her evening wear and fiercely proclaiming that her connections had true power, "Thank you very much," which blended into the next image where she stood by the monastery pond, proudly accepting his praise of the reflections she had created in the water. Even the early memories of watching her laugh gleefully as she made rainbow tea for Lady Edelgard, or of being scolded by her after she had run straight into him in the library, brought a smile to his face. In fact, he couldn't recall a single time when he had not enjoyed her company, which seemed odd considering how long ago they first met, but nevertheless rang true. And there was something indescribable, intangible about being in her company most of the time. Something that caused his feet to become a little lighter and his mind a little clearer. He rarely found himself in situations where he had to strain himself not to smile, but in her vicinity, it was almost as though another Hubert peered through the cracks of the hard shell he had built himself, a younger Hubert, intrigued by the strong sunshine outside. A Hubert who wanted to be as joyful and carefree as Constance von Novelli, and who could barely keep himself from being pulled along for the ride. A Hubert who wanted to find out just how far into the sunlight he could go, for how long he could stay without getting burned. And all of this, all of the joy and surprise and warmth she brought him, he might lose, just like that. Just because he was too afraid to leap and have faith. Running a hand over his face, he sighed and tore himself out of his place in front of the shelf. Crow, who had laid to rest on the floor behind him, immediately got to his paws and followed him out of the library. No way. He was too far gone at this point. He was no longer willing to risk it. She came to slowly, like snow melting at the first warm rays of sun in springtime. Stretching out her limbs, she winced at how sore they all felt, but could not remember why all that well. Her eyes opened, and at first she did not recognize her surroundings. The first thing that struck her was that there was no bed above her, the second, that there were windows to her left. She frowned at the latter, trying to figure out where she had found herself if not in abyss. And then it clicked. The infirmary. She could recall faint scenes from returning to the monastery early in the morning, atop a wild bird with Hubert's arms tightly wrapped around her waist. She remembered asking Yuri why he was not coming with them to the infirmary, and him telling her that he just needed rest and would get it in his own space. She remembered being supported by Sylvain up the stairs, remembered thinking how relieved she was that he managed not to make any inappropriate jokes on her behalf, and then being told by Linhard to lie down in one of the beds so that he could examine her again. And after that, turning her head to her right, she blinked at the empty bed beside her. The blanket and sheets seemed completely unmoved, but she could have sworn that Hubert had lain down on that very bed, reassuring her that he would get some well-needed rest. And yet, Hubert was nowhere to be seen. But she was here in the infirmary with sore limbs, so surely none of it of Shamhala, of her saving Hubert, had been imagination? She groaned as she turned to lie on her back again. It didn't exactly help that everything was so quiet, as though she was in a dream. But no, yesterday had certainly happened. She had been brought to Shamhala by none other than Thales himself. She had figured out how to use the city's power against them, and she had convinced Hubert not to push her away yet again. They had escaped his cell, only to run into Thales and Lysias, and Yuri and the others had arrived just in time. And then, the sound of the doorknob turning pulled her out of her thoughts. She quickly pushed herself up into a seated position, watching with a frown as the door opened and none other than Hubert walked into the room, followed by a large wolf right on his heel. He was pale, but not as deathly pale as when last she saw him. His eyes were focused, his hair clean and brushed, and his posture straight. He was even wearing a variant of his uniform again. It was not quite identical to the one stolen by Lysias, which made her wonder whether it had been a conscious choice to adjust some of the details. They had no way of knowing whether Lysias was still alive, so even slight changes in clothing might be a strategy on Hubert's part. If he one day showed up in his old uniform, they would know to be suspicious. She half expected to see the black veins on his hands as she lowered her gaze to where they hung by his sides, but he had put on his white gloves again, hiding them from view. And as she let her gaze move further down, she took in the happy wolf that stood by his side. Constance raised her eyebrows as she met Hubert's gaze again. He sighed, but he was smiling. "He hasn't let me out of his sight since I left this room," he said, shaking his head. "He even tried to jump into the bathtub with me." She raised a hand to her mouth to hide her giggle, then gasped as his words sank in. "You had a bath? Oh, what I wouldn't give for a nice, warm soak in a tub filled with rose-scented water." "That can certainly be arranged," he said. "I'll have someone see to it as soon as I leave." She sighed dreamily at the thought of sinking down into hot water, cleansing her of filth and weariness both in one fell swoop. Perhaps then she would feel more like herself again. But wait. What was that last part? As soon as I leave? He was leaving her again already? How long had she slept? He must have seen her expression change, for his smile faded, and then he took a few tentative steps toward her bed. He stopped at a respectable distance, though, too far away in her opinion, but she supposed it was the proper thing to do under the circumstances. "I need to prepare for the upcoming mission," he explained. "We are leaving for the kingdom tomorrow." "So soon?" she gasped, throwing the blanket off her legs and pushing herself to her feet. "Why did no one tell me? I have to check on my Pegasus." Hubert immediately stepped in her way, firmly gripping her shoulders. She blinked up at him, her thoughts momentarily halted. "You are not coming," he said. What? Had she not proven again and again how vital she was in battle? Even in Shamhala, when he had entirely on his own free will told her that she was incredible. "Excuse me," she exclaimed and shoved at him with her hand, at which he just moved one of his own hands from her shoulder to capture her wrist. "You need me." "That may be so," he said, "but we don't know what consequences may follow from the curse. You could just as quickly become a liability in the midst of battle, and that is the last thing we need at such a vital point." "Again with the curse," she snapped. "I am completely fine. Linhard could find nothing when he examined me." Hubert's expression hardened, as did his grip around her. "I saw the curse strike you with my own eyes," he said. "A curse cast by an experienced elder mage, no less. If Linhard found no discernible effects, it was only because Lysias did not want any to be found. We need to proceed with caution until we have had the time to look into this more thoroughly, and as of right now, that time does not exist. We need to focus on the coming battle against the kingdom. Constance glared up at him. She knew deep down that he was right to be cautious, but she hated the idea of having to stay behind while the others risked their lives for the Empire. What if something happened to her friends? If something happened to Hubert, and she was not there to stop it? Do you understand? Hubert asked. Did she understand? Yes, she did. She understood his meaning crystal clear. Did she agree? No. But that had not been his question. Yes, she said reluctantly. I do. And this time, you will do as I ask. This time. Constance closed her eyes for a moment, swallowing. She supposed he was right to doubt her, but it still cut deep. Yes, she said, opening her eyes just in time to see his expression soften somewhat. He heaved a deep sigh, and when he spoke next, his voice was lower, almost weary. I have very limited experience with curses, he said as he released her wrist, but rest assured that I will get to the bottom of this. Until then, we shall need to keep you under surveillance. And under no circumstances will you meet with Lady Edelgard alone. Surveillance? She asked incredulously. Naturally, you will be free to roam the monastery, he said, as long as you are accompanied by someone who is aware of your condition and capable of handling any situations that may arise from it. She looked away, knowing that there was no sense in arguing. On the inside, she was boiling with frustration. She could accept that she would not be allowed to join the battle, but to have her followed around, like a criminal? Surely Hubert did not enjoy imposing these rules on her, and she understood why they were necessary, but that did not take away the feeling that he still did not trust her. When she did not speak, Hubert sighed, and released her shoulder as well. I understand that this is a grave violation of your integrity. For this reason, I have asked Yuri to be your chaperone for now, and he has agreed under the condition that this is what you prefer. Of course, I assume he has his own duties to see to. If you wish to move around freely at your own leisure, one of my men might be a better option. I shall take that into consideration, she said quietly, without meeting his eyes. And how long will I remain under surveillance? If we have seen no signs of a curse's effects in a month, I will re-evaluate the decision. Re-evaluate, not necessarily rescind. And he had been surprised that she went against his wishes again and again. But this time, she would attempt not to. She would attempt to follow his wishes this once, if only because she had failed him so many times in the past that she needed to show him now that he could trust her when it truly mattered. So even though she felt like screaming out in frustration, she only huffed out a fair enough. He nodded, seeming to relax slightly. She took a step back, and as she happened to glance downward, she realized that she was wearing nothing but the short pink dress she usually wore under all of her armor. Without the rest of the pieces of her outfit, she felt extremely exposed all of a sudden. Throwing her arms around herself to cover her chest, she cast down her eyes. You must forgive my indecency, she murmured. She already felt her cheeks warm, her previous emotions all but evaporating. There is no need for concern, he assured her. You are in the infirmary. The most important thing is that you are comfortable. She gazed down at her naked feet and legs. The most important thing. Somehow, she doubted that he truly meant that. For him, the most important thing was that she complied with his orders, that she did not expose his liege to any unnecessary risks. If it hadn't been for Lady Edelgard, would he have been this harsh? Or would he have taken the risk? If it hadn't been for Lady Edelgard, she supposed he would have been able to stay by Constance's side rather than let someone else keep an eye on her. And if something had happened then, he would have known how to handle it. How to handle her. But alas, with Lady Edelgard in the picture, other duties would always come first. As they always will. But this is what I chose, is it not? By choosing to be with Hubert, she had also accepted the terms of a relationship with him. And he had been very clear on what those terms entailed, she could not fault him for that. Still, she could not help but wonder. Did he truly love her the way she loved him? Or did he simply find her to be a somewhat enjoyable pastime, to please himself with when his other duties had been taken care of? She squeezed her eyes closed in frustration. No, What was she thinking? She knew that he loved her. She could tell it from his voice, his gaze, his touch, even the fact that he was still standing here in complete silence even after he had finished what he came for, when he surely had other duties to see to. So why did she feel as though it had all been her imagination? She glanced toward the window, almost expecting to meet a ray of sunlight, for why else would she be doubting herself in this way? But no, today was a dark and rainy day, and so she had no excuse to feel dejected. None but the possibility of being turned down once again. She was painfully aware that, as of yet, he hadn't mentioned anything that happened between them. Not the rescue, not the fight, not the kiss. Nor did he show any kind of emotion toward her. Why did he not mention it? Constance. She forced herself to look at him, and saw that he was studying her in the same way he often seemed to be doing lately, intensely, pensively, as though she was a puzzle he still hadn't quite figured out. "You may leave now," she said quietly. "There is no need for you to remain. You have said what you came here to say." His eyebrows knit together. "You believe you can read me well enough to draw such a conclusion? I would call you naive, but I suspect your rationality is simply failing you at the moment." He paused, looking toward the window with a sigh. "There is one other thing, in fact." Her fingers clenched around her upper arms as she debated with herself whether to return to the bed or not. It would certainly be the most prudent to do so, but something was keeping her in place. A little voice, telling her that she should stay near him. With how grave his expression was, she had nothing to cling to but hope, and even that was slowly dwindling as he continued to gaze out at the rain outside. She sighed nervously, raising a hand to comb it through her curls. "When this war is over, and I am back from the kingdom," he said after a long moment of silence, "I would like to see you, at a location of your choice. There are some things I need to get in order, and I know I have already made you wait long enough, but," he paused to look back at her again, and his gaze almost seemed to plead with her. "Please, have patience until I return. That is all I ask." Her hand stilled. She looked away, hoping that her long hair would shield her face from his view as her cheeks began to heat up. The hope that she had been trying to drown sparked to life again as she dared to dream. "Might I ask what to expect?" she asked, forcing a calm voice that did not at all reflect how she felt on the inside. He let out an amused huff that also seemed to reveal a hint of nervousness. She wished she could have seen his face. "Well," he said, drawing out the word almost as though he dreaded the continuation of his own sentence. "The truth, I suppose." Constance wanted to swallow, her throat having gone instantly dry, but she forced herself to keep still. "The truth? About what, exactly?" He didn't answer immediately. When she dared to turn her head enough that she could see his expression, she caught him gazing out the window again. "About many things," he said distantly. "About the ritual. About my place in Lady Edelgard's life. And, about you and me. But before I can do that, I need to find some of those answers for myself." He turned back to look at her, and then he reached out and took her hand in his. She drew for air, confusion coloring her thoughts even as the sensation of his clothed fingers sliding against her bare ones sent a wave of heat through her body. Was he using some sort of elder magic on her, or was she truly this easily affected by a mere touch of his hand now? As she watched in stunned silence, he raised her hand to his lips and placed a feather-light kiss on her knuckles, all while holding her gaze. "Will you wait for me?" he asked in a low voice, "Sunshine?" She drew in a trembling breath. His gaze was deep and sincere as he slowly lowered her hand again, and she had the distinct feeling that whatever she chose to reply to this question, it would seal her fate with him for good. There was no doubt that she wanted to wait for him, and this time it sounded as though he truly understood what she wanted from him, as though he wanted to give it to her. And, truth be told, hadn't her fate been sealed the minute he decided to write his first message in the margins of the compendium? What else was there to do but say yes? Not trusting her voice to hold, she swallowed, and gave him a firm nod. Now, finally, she actually saw a sign of emotion in his face. It flashed past, there and gone in a second, but she had seen it, she was sure of it. Whether it was relief or anxiousness, however, she could not discern. "You have my gratitude," he said, bowing his head before he straightened again and let her hand fall back to her side, "and my apologies, I really need to leave." I'm afraid I have already stayed too long. He began to turn, and before she could even make a conscious decision, her hand had shot out to grab his wrist. He stopped, looking back at her with just a hint of caution in his eyes. "Hubert," she said quietly, bravely meeting his gaze. "Make certain to come back in one piece, or I shall never let your soul rest." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see his shoulders relax somewhat as he took in her warning. But then a smile tugged at his lips, something playful gleaming behind his gaze. "I believe you," he said. "However, as your tutor in the dark methods," he leaned in toward her, as if to whisper a secret in her ear. Her breath caught when she felt his breath against the side of her jaw, the alluring scent of his shaving fragrance catching her poor senses off guard. "I feel obliged to tell you that a threat is supposed to be discouraging." Dumbfounded, she momentarily forgot how to breathe as she felt him step out of her grasp, and she could only watch in silence as he reached back to open the door, wearing the same remarkable smirk that she only ever saw him aim in her direction. "Until next time, Constance," he said, then turned and stepped through the doorway. Even after the door had closed, she stood in the same place for a long moment, staring after him. Only when a lightning strike in the distance startled her out of her daze did she walk back to sit on the sick bed. She held her hands over her chest, the hand he had kissed being the closest to her heart, and considered what he had told her. A threat is supposed to be discouraging. What in the world was that supposed to mean? Had he just insulted her capacities to threaten someone? With a loud and drawn-out sigh, she let herself fall onto her back, staring up into the ceiling. But then as she let the words marinate in her mind, she found herself beginning to smile, and a moment after, to giggle to herself. She rolled onto her side, pulling the blanket up to her face to shriek into it. Butterfly wings fluttered in her chest. It made little sense, he had hardly even said anything, so why was she reacting as though he had just proposed to her? But he practically had, hadn't he? If the thought of her never letting his soul rest was desirable to him rather than deterring, surely she was not rash to presume that he wished to have her by his side in life as well as in death, and was that not in theory identical to wishing to marry her? With no warning, the memory of his hot breath against her jaw invaded her mind and her senses of his soft words caressing her skin, followed by an almost physical memory of their kiss in Shambhala, his hand tangled in her hair, his teeth grazing her lips. She whined and closed her eyes, grateful that she was alone in the room. Regardless of how things stood between them from one moment to the next, one thing was for certain: she was entirely, overwhelmingly, wholly, and incredibly infatuated with Hubert von Vestra, and she had little hope of ever overcoming those emotions. But perhaps, if her interpretation of his words was not completely off the mark, she would not need to. Chapter 24, We Who Rule the Shadows. Let's see. This sign here should be correct. The line goes there, and then the algebra should be. Yes. Yes. But then why does it not work? Ugh. With a wide sweep of her hand, Constance erased everything on the blackboard and began to write her formula anew, eyebrows pinched together in annoyance. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Yuri lean an elbow against the table as he turned toward her in his seat. "You all right there, shady lady?" "No," she growled as she scribbled out the rest of the formula, mouthing the signs to herself as she wrote. She stepped back to study her work, chewing on the inside of her cheek. Was this one even different, or would she run into the same error again? Taking a deep breath, she called on the elder magic from within, moving her hands in a smooth twirling movement in front of her as she tried to shape the spell. A glowing magic circle appeared beneath her feet, but as soon as sparks of magic began to materialize around her hands, everything fizzled and vanished again. She stomped her foot into the floor in frustration, picking up the chalk and angrily throwing it at the board, causing it to break in 2 pieces. "I cannot for the life of me figure out what is wrong with this spell." She spun on her heel, returning to the table where Yuri sat. Leaning over the mess of scrolls, notebooks, and tomes on her side, she let her gaze scan the various pages for a clue on how to continue. Her hair fell into her face, even after she had tried to tuck it behind her ears several times, and with a loud sigh, she straightened and ran her hands over her hair to move her hairband backward and tie her annoying curls into a ponytail on the back of her head. "Have you considered taking a break?" Yuri asked, following the movement with his eyes. "You've been at it for hours. Your mind probably just needs rest." No, she muttered as she seated herself, turning her attention to one book in particular, the Compendium of Light and Dark. It had been years since she and Hubert last communicated with each other through the book, but many of his notes on elder magic were still useful even now. Still, though, he had never really taught her how to combine elder magic with other kinds of magic, which was what she was currently attempting. Many years ago, shortly before the war began, he had helped her create an elder formula with black magic aspects interwoven into the spell as variables, the tracing spell that she had successfully managed to adapt so that it could help the wolf locate him. But he had never taught her how to do it herself, or whether it was possible to combine two arts more seamlessly rather than having one of them simply amplify the other. "I do not need rest," she said ruefully. "What I need is Hubert." She browsed through the chapter on dark magic, finding nothing of much use to her at the moment, before moving her attention to the stack of old letters she had placed to the side. They had been discussing elder magic there as well, but for her to go through dozens of letters in search of a crumb when she knew there wouldn't be any that could help her figure this particular puzzle out, it would objectively be a waste of time. With a groan, she closed the book and leaned forward to rest her forehead against its front. Hubert, along with Sylvain, Happy and the rest of the troops who had marched toward the final battle against the kingdom had been gone for 2 weeks. She had no way of knowing how much longer it would take, but there was one thing she was very certain of. If she found out that she had to spend 2 more weeks in Yuri's presence, she might just decide to jump into the dark waters of Abyss. It wasn't that he was annoying her all the time, and she had to admit that out of all the people she could think of to have to spend this much time with, she would rather it be Yuri than anyone else. But to almost never get a moment to herself was not something she was used to, nor was it anything she would wish on her worst enemy. Except, perhaps, for Lysias. But only because he had been the one to cause this horrible mess in the first place. "What kind of spell are you working on, anyway? Can't it wait?" She sighed. "I want to find a way to prove that there is, in fact, no curse affecting me. I fear Hubert may never rescind these restrictions unless I can show him hard evidence." Yuri exhaled in amusement. "You're going to prove something doesn't exist? And how the hell are you going to go about that? There are light spells to reveal that which is hidden, and dark spells to trace powerful magic. My hope is to combine the two kinds into one, possibly proving that if there had been a curse, my spell would have revealed it." She sat up again, giving a dejected shrug. "Truthfully, I do not even know whether it is possible to combine light magic and dark magic. But I simply must try." He smiled faintly. "If anyone can do it, it'll be you." She sighed. "Thank you. But for now," he continued, standing from his seat, "I think you should rest. Try to think about something else for a while." "Oh, believe me, I would love to, but however am I supposed to do that?" she asked, watching him stop next to the table and lean in over her books. He started closing the remaining tomes and notebooks, piling them into neat stacks. "Like this," he said, and when he was finished, he straightened, gave her a wry smile and crossed his arms over his chest as he leaned against the table. "And with my charm." "Ha," she said. "For a moment, you made me hopeful." Yuri raised his eyebrows, and she instantly knew that she had made a mistake. There was no question in her book that he had considered that a challenge. "Now behave," she warned before he could say anything, leaning back somewhat as she raised a hand and peered at him cautiously. "I'll have you know, I am practically engaged." That was just a slight overstatement, considering what Hubert had told her when last they met. Yuri gave her an amused smirk, tilting his head to the side. "Yeah? Is that why you've started dressing more modestly recently?" Caught off guard, she glanced down at her choice of clothing. Today, she wore a fitted gray dress with a long skirt and sleeves and a tall buttoned collar, not exactly the same model as her favorite during her time in the academy, but she supposed it covered more skin than her battle clothing had ever done. She had to admit that it was somewhat unfamiliar to her at this point. She seemed to have gotten used to the more agile wear over the years. She looked up at him defiantly. "No," she said with a small huff. "I simply see no point in wearing my battle wear when the war is about to end. You don't have to wear long dresses just because we're in a time of peace, you know," he teased. "There is a middle ground, I'm sure." She looked away, feeling somewhat stupid all of a sudden. She supposed she could take another look at her wardrobe. She had changed in these 5 years after all. It was only natural to let that change be reflected in her clothing. Either way, it's been a while since I saw you so covered up, Yuri said. His voice was so matter-of-factly, she had some difficulty determining at first whether he was jesting with her or not. But then he solved that little conundrum as he continued, "It does bring back memories from a simpler, more innocent time. A time when I could fluster you with the tiniest little comment. Like, 'That dress really flatters your elbows.'" She swatted him on the arm with a groan, at which he burst into laughter. "See? Not even a hint of a blush. You have said much more brutish things to me in the past, and you know it." He raised his eyebrows as well as his hands. "Guilty," he acknowledged, "but in my defense, I am very amusing to fluster." Yes, I know," she said as she rolled her eyes. "You do love to inform me of that. I was going to say that you do have very attractive elbows." She let out a frustrated groan, giving him a narrow-eyed glare as she shoved his arm a little harder this time. "Ugh. Do you ever stop? You know, I much prefer my mental version of you." Only when Yuri made a choked sound did she realize her mistake. She would have to be more careful around him, this wouldn't do. Turning her suddenly burning face away from him, she cleared her throat and hoped he would take the hint. But when had Yuri ever dropped the ball? "What was that?" he asked in a voice that was clearly strained in an attempt not to sound too curious. "Did you say?" "Oh, here we go." She supposed she only had herself to blame. Yes, she said with a loud sigh, "I seem to have a version of you in my head who shows up to mock me when I least need it." "Oh." He laughed. "Now I'm intrigued for real. When this mental Yuri speaks to you, what does he say?" She was just about to snub him when she came to the realization that perhaps it would be best to simply lay all the cards on the table. That would give him less to work with if he wanted to try flustering her. So she put on a nonchalant expression and replied. "He helped me devise a strategy for how to escape Shambhala. His suggestions were rather helpful, but no wonder, since in reality it was all me. I do tend to come up with excellent ideas, even under pressure." Yuri's smile twitched, threatening to turn into a smirk again. "That may be true, but I'm still flattered." He smoothly sailed over to his side of the table again. "If your problem-solving persona wears my face, I must have been doing something right." She gave him a furtive glance as he sat down to focus on his own papers. Doing something right? Once again, she couldn't tell whether he was being serious or not. For all his outward confidence, sometimes these little hints of insecurity shone through the cracks. Certainly he must know that he was an inspiration to her when it came to his problem-solving skills. "Yuri," she said softly, causing him to lift his head and meet her gaze again. "You do know. Hey, where's our welcome home party?" Yuri's gaze darted over her shoulder as she turned her head toward the doorway, where Sylvain and Happy just walked in. They wore their full armor, looking weary and beaten, but they were alive. Heart jumping in her chest, Constance leaped up and ran over to the couple, throwing her arms around Happy's neck with a whine. "Thank the goddess," she breathed. "You've been away for so long. I nearly thought." "Oh, never mind." With relief flooding her body, she almost wanted to laugh at the ridiculous notion that Happy and Sylvain wouldn't have survived. They were two of the strongest, most capable fighters she knew. Happy, who had made a surprised yelp at the forceful embrace, finally wrapped her arms around Constance's back. "We're okay, Coco," she said. "Though I kinda just want to fall face first into a bed and sleep for a week." "I take it the war is over, then?" Yuri asked. "Yeah," Sylvain confirmed in a low, almost mournful voice. "Fergus has fallen. Dimitri is." He trailed off into a telling silence. Constance pulled away from Happy and looked at Sylvain, whose gaze was distant and glazed over as he stared down into the floor. Happy moved to his side and tugged him into her arms, at which he seemed to partly snap out of his daze and let out a shuddering sigh. "Either way," he said in a somewhat lighter voice that was clearly forced. "It's over. I hope." "And Hubert?" Yuri asked, causing Constance to spin toward him in surprise. He just glanced at her before returning his attention to the red-headed couple. "He in one piece." Constance swallowed as she turned to Sylvain again, not wanting to even consider the thought that Hubert might have perished in the final battle before they could even have the conversation he had promised her. If he didn't return, she would have to make good on her threat, to never let his soul rest in peace. But he couldn't, he just couldn't. Oh yeah, Happy said with a nod as she pulled away from Sylvain. He's fine, I think. I didn't see him much at all. He kept zipping between targets with his magic, showing up for like 3 seconds to slit someone's throat before disappearing again, but I heard he played a big part in our victory in the end. Apparently there was a moment of hesitation on Eddie's part when she faced Diddy, and the bird stopped him from spearing her, giving her a chance to snap out of it and deal the final blow. I bet he's real proud of that. Constance exhaled in relief, bringing a hand to her chest. She supposed he would be proud that he had managed to be of such great use to the Empress, although she highly doubted he would ever confess to it. He would simply dismiss it with a comment such as, "I only did what was required of me. Nothing more, nothing less." He didn't return with the rest of us, though, Sylvain said. He and Edelgard and a few of their troops continued on to Fhirdiad to make sure the shift in power would go smoothly. They'll probably be back in a week or 2. Oh, Constance said quietly. I see. 2 more weeks with Yuri then, and without Hubert. Disappointment surged through her, but she forced herself to think positive. She had waited for so long already, she supposed she could wait a while longer. The most important thing was that he was alive. Well, Yuri said, patting her on the shoulder as he regarded Sylvain and Happy. I guess a welcome home party is in order, but I think you two need some time to recharge first, yeah? Let me set things up for tomorrow, and all you have to do is show up. Sounds good. Sylvain grinned. Sounds great, actually. He tugged Happy to his side again, leaning down to peck her on the forehead. Come on, let's go rid ourselves of these awful clothes and armor. Happy scoffed, pulling out of his grip as she gave him a deadpan look. Yeah, but just so you know, I'm gonna sleep. You hear? Sleep. He chuckled, turning to follow her when she started to leave. You know, I think I've heard that line somewhere before. Was it, the night before the battle? He raised his pitch to make a bad interpretation of Happy. We need to sleep, Sylvain, we need the energy, Sylvain. Followed by, what if we die, Sylvain? She shoved his arm. Shut up. I'm just saying, I wasn't the one who couldn't keep their hands to. Shut up. Sylvain's hearty chuckle echoed down the halls as they took a left outside the doors, moving out of range for Constance to be able to discern the continuation of their banter. She turned to Yuri with her eyebrows raised, at which he burst into laughing and walked back to the table to get his things in order. Well, seems like you'll be stuck with me a while longer, he said. So what do you say? Want to plan a party together? She sighed heavily. I suppose I have no choice. Constance wrapped her arms over her chest in an attempt to still her racing heart. Her gaze rested unseeingly on the dark water below, only half registering the glittering swirls of light reflecting the torches fastened to the walls. In the distance, she could hear someone's roguish laughter, and then closer by, the whispers of a secret deal taking place. If she listened closely, she could hear the soft pitter-patter of a rat in the wall, and echoing from the northeastern corridor were shouts and metal clangs of battle, probably performed for a gambling audience. She wouldn't call them pleasant sounds perhaps, but they were nevertheless the sounds of her home. How things can change over time. She couldn't even imagine what 15-year-old Constance might have thought of Abyss. She definitely wouldn't have thought that it could ever feel like home to her, that was for certain. She turned her head to the left, then to the right, before returning her gaze to the water again with a sigh. She had left the note in a place where she was certain it would be found, but perhaps she had been too optimistic as for the time chosen for their meeting? She knew he had returned to Garreg Mach several hours ago, so he should have had plenty of time to find the note. But perhaps, she thought with a worried twang, she had put too much faith in his ability to find this particular place. The whispers had died out now, causing her to look in the direction they had come from. While she could hear many parts of Abyss from here, few people ever came to this place. She had found it sometime in the early days of the war, and chosen it as her preferred place to write letters to Hubert or, as she had known him then, Crow. The hypnotizing glowing swirls in the water had stolen her gaze whenever she pondered on the next phrase to ink, and the thought that they would be here for this meeting brought her some measure of comfort. That is, if the meeting ever took place at all. She was beginning to seriously consider leaving when some of the golden swirls in the water were exchanged for dark violet, and a tingle ran up her spine. She took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself, before she turned around to face her visitor. A tall man dressed in dark garments, a gray buttoned shirt underneath a long black cape with a cowl, and simple dark blue pants tucked into sturdy black boots stood before her. He had his neck slightly bent forward, causing the top of the cowl to hang low enough over his face that she could not see his eyes. As he lifted his head, causing their gazes to meet, one corner of his mouth quirked up. Constance swallowed. She had imagined what words she would say in this moment, but seeing him now somehow made her mouth go dry. "Now that is an expression I know well," Hubert said in a sardonic voice. "But only rarely on you. Is this where you ask if I came here to kill you?" She let out an offended gasp. "Oh, you absolute show-off." "Yes," he said with a smirk, "you would know all about that, wouldn't you?" He raised a gloved hand to push the cowl back from his head, inadvertently ruffling his dark hair slightly through the friction. His gaze moved from his left to his right, taking in the area, although she had to assume he had already mapped it all out and ascertained that no unexpected surprises lurked in any corners. That was simply the way Hubert took in all areas as soon as he stepped into them. "Did you choose this meeting place for any particular reason?" he asked. She nervously smoothed her hands over her skirt. Taking Yuri's advice, she had made some changes to her wardrobe in the past week, nothing enormous yet, although she had taken the time to make certain adjustments to a few of her dresses. In fact, her favorite dress had been one of them. After some hesitation, she had cut off the sleeves and shortened the skirt so that it only reached the middle of her thighs. For propriety's sake, she had chosen to at least wear a pair of black tights beneath her skirt today, in combination with her knee-high boots. All in all, she was rather content with how it had turned out, and it seemed like a good middle ground to begin with. "I suppose I am fond of this place," she said, then gestured toward the edge of the pathway behind her, with the dark water beyond. "I sometimes used to sit here in the first 5 years of the war, watching the patterns in the water as I wrote to you." As she looked back at Hubert, she saw one corner of his mouth twitch. His gaze moved to the glittering swirls in the darkness below. "I see. It is rather enchanting." "It is," she agreed quietly. He looked back up at her, studying her face in silence. There was something so intense about his eyes that she found herself casting her own gaze down and squirming in place, heart throbbing in her chest as she tried to come up with something to say. It seemed neither knew how to broach the subject they both knew needed to be discussed. And now that they were finally completely alone together and in no hurry for the first time in a long while, the weight of it all hung heavily in the air. She had hoped that he would be the one to take the first leap of faith, but when she met his gaze again, she realized that he was waiting for her. He wanted her to take charge. And while part of her had wished he would lead, she had to confess that she appreciated the gesture. "Well," she said, exhaling heavily. He arched an eyebrow when she didn't continue, but she tried to pay it no mind. She wouldn't allow her ridiculous insecurities to ruin this. She was strong, confident, independent, in control. "I heard the operation was a success," she said, mentally cursing at herself for avoiding the crucial subject. "Congratulations on a well-executed strategy." He inclined his head to her. "Indeed, the King of Faerghus has fallen and Lady Edelgard has finally conquered her adversaries. The kingdom and the alliance, that is, I doubt we have seen the last of the former archbishop, who escaped the second we turned the tables on her. And Thales," she thought to herself with dismay. "They may have destroyed Shamhala, but they had no evidence that Thales or Lysias had been among the rebel. It was likely they had managed to escape before everything crumbled around them. We would have benefited from having you there," he added. "Perhaps then we might have defeated the church as well." "Oh," she said with a sly smile, crossing her arms over her chest. "Is this your attempt at an apology?" "I will not apologize for taking the necessary precautions," he said, expression stern. "Regardless of your skills, we have yet to learn what effects may follow from the curse. You could just as well have cost us everything." I am perfectly fine, she assured him with a sigh. 3 weeks have passed and nothing has changed. That may be so, but I still need more time to look into this, he said. A curse is a powerful and obscure kind of elder magic. I refuse to believe that the one Lysias cast was simply ineffective. It may be some dormant kind that will come into effect when we least expect it. She pursed her lips. It seemed to her that he was being overly cautious, perhaps even a bit irrational with his concern. 3 weeks without a speck of a sign, and he was still convinced the curse had been effective? However, seeing that she had even less knowledge of curses than him, there was little she could say without proof. And hopefully, he could help her figure out how to combine the spells needed to find that proof soon. I'm working on a spell to prove that the curse was just that, ineffective, she said, hurrying to continue when she saw his expression darken. I'm sure you did see it strike me, but clearly nothing has happened since then. If I can prove that no curse is currently affecting my body. And how will you prove that? He interjected sharply. I was thinking of combining light magic and elder magic, but for that, I shall need your help. Hubert shook his head and crossed his arms over his chest. Didn't I tell you years ago? You can't simply combine two completely different magical frameworks. You also told me that elder magic and faith magic build on the same foundation, she pointed out, and one of the first things you wrote in the compendium was that magic formulas and syntaxes are not as rigid as we are taught. Furthermore, you helped me combine lightning magic with the elder tracing spell, and that clearly worked, or I would have been unable to reach you with my letters. He sighed deeply, letting his arms fall back to his sides. Constance. I told you before leaving for the kingdom that I would return with the truth, and I will keep that promise. I have kept you in the dark for too long, about many things, but I've learned my lesson. Much of what has happened in the past could likely have been avoided, had I been more generous with my knowledge. I will not make the same mistake again. Therefore, I will be frank with you today, and I will begin by telling you the truth about the tracing spell. The amplification that I added into your formula did very little on its own. I'm sure you noticed that I adjusted the formula in other ways as well. She frowned, thinking back. Yes, he had added a few more aspects to the formula through magical notation, which she had then made use of without much thought at the time. The reason your tracing spell worked so well, he said, was because I adjusted it so that you would always be able to reach me with it. Me only. He huffed, glancing to the side. That may in fact be why Crow refuses to let me out of his sight even now. You've bound him to me through the use of your spell. Only reason he isn't with me right now is because he's currently asleep on my bed. Constance stared at him. Why would you do such a thing? We hadn't even begun to communicate by letter at that point. I did it because I knew that I needed a secure and reliable way to communicate with you while I was away, and by sending you that first note during the war, I was fairly confident I would lure you into trying to reach me with a response. But what if I had attempted to use the spell for other purposes? I would have reached you instead, she exclaimed, still not wanting to believe it. He had tricked her? At this, he gave her a somewhat weary smile. Naturally I added fail-safes into the formula. If you tried to reach anyone else but me, the spell would simply fizzle. Same thing if you went too far in your quest to find me. It was an incredibly restricted spell, quite honestly, a long shot that happened to work out just as I wanted it to. She couldn't believe it. All these years, 5 years of repeated use of the spell to send him letter after letter, and it had all been a lie? She had never managed to actually trace him at all? And if the tracing spell was a lie, then it wouldn't do her any good now in disproving the spell either. Feeling stupid for ever having believed in her skills in elder magic, she turned her face away from him. Were there more things he had lied about? More tricks that she had fallen for? All of this is to say, he continued, that there is no reliable way to combine different types of magic. The amplification part was not a lie. I have managed to use fire as an amplifier in my elder spells a few times. But to actually combine the two arts together? I don't see how that would be possible. Do you mean to say that there is no way to see whether I am cursed or not? She asked quietly. He was silent for a moment before answering, as though considering his response deeply. Were there such a spell, he said, I would have already cast it. I had my hopes on Linhardt's white magic, but it seems even he could not find anything, nor could he disprove that there was a curse in the first place. In other words, she was back to square one again, with near constant surveillance and no ideas on how to proceed. With a dejected sigh, she turned to face the water, wrapping her arms around herself as she stared down into the darkness. "What other lies have you told?" she asked, trying to keep her voice level. While she did not want there to have been any more lies, she knew better than to ignore the possibility. "I have likely told more than I can recall at the moment," he said, audibly uncomfortable about her question. She supposed she should at least be happy that he seemed to be telling the truth this time. "However," he continued, "most of them have been evasions rather than outright lies. In my defense, you have a discerning intellect, which is reflected in the kinds of questions you ask. You must understand that I needed to keep the more sensitive details from you, including the true nature of Lord Arundel and my involvement with those who slither in the dark. Other questions, such as those regarding my past, were necessary to evade in order to protect my identity or Lady Edelgard's integrity." "And the tutelage?" she asked. "Did you only approach me because you believed that I could be of use to your dear Empress?" "That may have been true at first," he acknowledged reluctantly behind her. "Where Lady Edelgard saw a trifling pastime, I saw the potential for something greater. So when I noticed you with the compendium, I decided to test the waters. You never were the kind to follow others blindly. I didn't need to push you very far to make you question the church. And by then, I had already seen evidence of your tenacity." She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly through her nose. Edelgard had never taken her seriously, then. What a fool she had been to believe otherwise. But the rest of Hubert's confession did not come as much surprise to her. She had already come to the conclusion on her own that he initially approached her as a kind of test, to determine whether she could be useful for Lady Edelgard. Fortunately for her, she had passed his test. And after she had proven her allegiance, he had been free to interact with her on slightly freer terms. She did not doubt that his intentions had changed along the way. Although certain details were still unclear between them, she knew that his feelings for her were true. However, it still hurt to hear that while she had gone into their communications with full sincerity, he had always been one step ahead of her, pulling at her strings from the shadows. Hubert's hand landed on her shoulder, prompting her to open her eyes and turn to face him. His expression was determined as his eyes scanned her face. "There is much in my past that I would prefer to keep buried," he said quietly. "But like I said earlier, I came here today to tell you the truth. I have spent much time in the past weeks pondering what parts to tell and which to leave out, and I came to the conclusion that I wanted to exclude nothing. I have already asked Lady Edelgard's permission to share the details of our common past, and she graciously agreed. So if you do not mind, I would like to answer the question you've told me so many times in the past, and which I have always evaded, how I became an elder mage." She stared up at him, all disappointment and sorrow having completely evaporated from her mind in favor of a rekindling of her old curiosity. When he didn't continue, she realized that he was waiting for her confirmation. "I would be honored to listen," she assured him solemnly. Hubert took a deep breath, holding his gaze for a moment before giving her a short nod back. "Thank you." He released her shoulder, took a step back and raised one of his hands between them. She watched in silence as he slowly reached up and removed his glove, revealing the dark web of veins covering his hand. It began just above the wrist as a few lines of faded gray, before deepening in color quickly thereafter and multiplying rapidly. He removed the glove on his other hand as well, tucked both gloves into his pants pocket, and held up his hands in front of her so that she could see them clearly. She followed the lines with her eyes, swallowing as he flexed his fingers, since it seemed to make the dark veins glimmer in the light from the nearby torches. "I told you long ago that faith magic and elder magic are like two sides of the same coin," he said after a beat, watching her face closely as she continued to stare at his hands in awe. "Elder magic is a warped variant of faith magic. They parted ways many, many years ago, but they are still similar enough that the methods of one can be explained with the other. In this case, I believe the Agarthans were the ones who first discovered the crest ritual, and as such, they have been fine-tuning it for centuries." "The Elder Ritual?" Constance asked quietly. "Not precisely," he said. "Or rather, yes, but not necessarily the one you are thinking of. This is one detail I have kept from you until now. There are, in fact, two kinds of elder procedures. One of them is the ritual I have told you about, which entails either implanting a crest stone imbued with Agarthan technology into the chest or drinking the blood of another elder mage, with the purpose of granting more power to the subject. The other is the procedure of implanting a foreign crest into the bloodstream itself, a drawn-out and horrific ritual which Thales and his mages exposed Lady Edelgard to, as well as all of her siblings, many years ago. He drew in a deep, shuddering breath, clenching his jaw. Now, seeing that this procedure aims to activate a crest, it is much more lethal if the subject already possesses one. Which, being descendants of Wilhelm von Hresvelg, Lady Edelgard, and her siblings did. Due to this lethality, all but Lady Edelgard perished during the procedure. Constance glanced up at his face, catching a brief flicker of pain in his eyes. She had heard rumors that Lady Edelgard possessed two crests, but quickly dismissed the idea since it seemed that it must obviously be humanly impossible. Clearly, she had been too hasty in her judgment. But all of that notwithstanding, she still didn't quite grasp what he was trying to tell her. "I do not understand," she said, lowering her gaze to his hands again. "How are the two rituals related? Are you saying that you were forcefully implanted with a crest as well?" "Not quite. The purpose was never to grant me a crest," he trailed off. "It's quite a long story. I am in no hurry, believe me." Hubert exhaled in a half-sigh. "Very well. I will tell you the story that I have yet to tell anyone. Not even Lady Edelgard." He lowered his hands, then let his gaze move over to the water, his eyes glazing over. For a while, none of them spoke. She assumed that he needed some time to begin on his own terms. Not knowing what else to do while she waited, however, she carefully reached over and took one of his hands in hers. He didn't stop her. In fact, his fingers squeezed her back. It filled her with an unexpected warmth. "I first met Lady Edelgard when she was 4, and I was 6, he began after another moment. "My house has served hers for many generations. From the moment I was born, I belonged to the Hresvelgs. I remember little of my earliest childhood, but I've been told that even from a very young age, my father began to teach me the skills I would need to fulfill my purpose. Stealth, knife-wielding, assassination, social manipulation. Along with the less nefarious skills that are expected from a nobleman, of course, so that I would fit right in with Lady Edelgard and her siblings in their royal circles. Dancing, politics, how to carry myself in polite society, I suspect this part of my education was not so different from yours." She nodded thoughtfully. She remembered wondering at the night of the ball where Hubert had learned to dance so remarkably well. Her best guess had been that he had learned to dance because nobles were expected to know the craft. Apparently that guess hadn't been far from the truth. "I do not remember ever questioning any of it," he continued. "My righteous place was by the Hresvelgs' side, and it still is. But I suppose there was a time when I simply served the imperial line because it was what I was meant to do, it was my duty as a Vestra. Then Lady Edelgard was injured on my watch, and my father scolded me harshly for not living up to my duties as her servant. After that day, I made certain to accompany her whenever she left the palace. And while I was naturally supposed to serve all of the Hresvelgs, I found myself growing especially fond of Lady Edelgard, who saw me not only as a servant but treated me in many ways as a friend. After she had grown used to having me so often by her side, she began inviting me to play with her, to listen to her troubles, to join her on picnics in the palace gardens. Perhaps I should not have allowed that to impact me, but I must admit that it was endearing enough that I came to favor her over the others." He paused to take a deep breath. "And then, she was stolen from us. Ripped out of her home and brought by Lord Arundel, as far as I can assume, the real Lord Arundel, not Thales, to the Faerghus kingdom with no warning." The corners of his mouth turned downward. He gazed out over the water with something akin to anxiety in his eyes. "I cannot even begin to describe how horrific it was to lose her. She meant everything to me. I was only 10 at the time, but I still left the city in a mad rush to rescue her. My father had taught me well, I suppose. It took 3 days for his soldiers to capture me and bring me back. Of course, it was a hopeless endeavor to go after her, one doomed to fail from the very beginning. I never would have reached Ferdiad. The image of a 10-year-old Hubert desperately fighting off experienced Vestris soldiers in his search for a young Princess Edelgard was not at all shocking to Constance. She could see it in her mind's eye, a rogue boy with hair as dark as the night and eyes like a reptile, his hands glowing ceaselessly as he fired whatever spells he could conjure at his persecutors. Or, perhaps, his blades gleaming in the moonlight. When she returned 4 years later, Lord Arundel had presumably been killed, with Thales surreptitiously assuming his place. I swore that I would never let anything happen to Lady Edelgard again under my watch. But Thales had other plans for her, and I was completely powerless. I could do nothing to stop him from performing his wicked experiments on her and her siblings. At this point, Hubert's voice had lost most of its usual calmness. Constance clasped his hand harder in her grip to signal that he could take whatever time he needed. She would be there. He swallowed thickly and squeezed her hand back once before forcing himself to continue speaking. It went on for many months, until Lady Edelgard was the only one who remained. The experiments had been successful at least in Thales' eyes. She had gained the crest of flames, and her hair had lost all color in the process. She was no longer the same girl as she had once been, she was more serious and much less lively, her youthful innocence all but gone. In the first months afterward, she hardly even spoke to me. And still, I would do anything for her. I would eliminate any resistance she faced, color the path she walked red with blood, if necessary. Nothing was more important to me at the time, and that has not changed since. Hubert let out a sharp exhalation. That was when Thales approached me. Feeding on his most devout wishes, Constance thought to herself. Just as Thales had tried to do with her. He seemed very adept at that kind of manipulation. But the thought that he had once done it with Hubert, a desperate, 15-year-old boy, made her blood boil. He saw my dedication to Lady Edelgard, and offered to grant me the power I would need to keep protecting her even in her new shape. Desperate as I was, I barely even considered the consequences. I accepted his offer. He performed the elder ritual on you, she whispered, clenching her free hand into a tight fist at her side. For the first time during his story, Hubert met her gaze. Indeed. I didn't ask for details, it didn't matter what he did to me, so long as it would serve Lady Edelgard. However, while this ritual is similar to the procedure performed on her, it is much less volatile. The purpose is not to implant a crest, but to pass on the Agarthan powers and grant more magical strength as well as resilience. As I already told you, an Agarthan crest stone is implanted into the chest during the ritual. This is true for the crest experiment as well, meaning that Lady Edelgard has one, as, apparently, does Byleth, although through a similar procedure performed by the Church. While it came as something of a shock to hear that Edelgard had a crest stone in her chest, it made sense that Byleth had undergone some kind of procedure as well. She remembered discussing it briefly with Hubert in the margins of the compendium, why it was that Byleth could utilize his relic without the use of a crest stone. As far as she could recall, they had never reached a conclusion on that particular subject, but she supposed Hubert had dug into it more closely on his own. After the ritual, I ended up with magical power I hadn't even thought possible. Even with little formal training in reason at that point, I could conjure incredibly powerful spells. Hence why I decided to dedicate myself more fully to magic after that, letting my skills with blades come second. But, he raised the hand she was holding between them, once again showing the black, dimly iridescent webs on his hands. Even with a crest stone to help process the stronger spells, such powerful elder magic takes a toll on the body. This pattern of webs first began to appear on my fingertips soon after the ritual, but it has spread steadily since then. It does not seem to impact my health in any particular way, however. Constance looked down at his fingers, which were intertwined with hers. While his wrists were mostly free from the black web, his fingers were almost completely covered in it. Both Thales and Lysias wore gloves, she suddenly remembered. As does Lady Edelgard. Yes, he said ruefully, I'm sorry to say that even Lady Edelgard has discolored fingertips. I believe this is an inescapable side effect of the Elder Ritual, regardless of version. She has access to the same kind of magic as I do, but she refrains from using it when it isn't strictly necessary. Hence why the discoloration hasn't spread quite as far. Constance nodded slowly as she considered this. Her gaze slid over to his chest, as if there was a possibility that she could see through his skin and bones to discern the crest stone inside. Of course, she saw nothing. The only sign of the ritual, she had to assume, was the dark web on his hands. Hubert surprised her then by lifting her hand to his chest and pressing her palm flat against it. She held her breath while she waited, but even when she held completely still, she felt no discernible heartbeat. There was something else, however. It was incredibly discreet, so discreet that she might not have even noticed it if it weren't for her complete and utter focus on how his chest felt against her palm. A dull sensation that she could only describe as a kind of vibration seemed to emanate from his chest and reverberate through her hand, and she suddenly realized that this was not the first time she had sensed it. The first time had been after the scene by the pond, whereby he had teleported them into an empty dorm room. She had pressed both of her palms against his chest, and she had felt a similar kind of shiver in her hands then. Could it be? Another memory popped into her mind, something she'd hardly paid any mind to when she first experienced it, which, in hindsight, was perhaps understandable but which she now realized could have important repercussions that Hubert needed to be made aware of. "Hubert," she said urgently, curling her fingertips into his chest. "I believe I know what they wanted your crest stone for, and possibly your blood, as well." Hubert frowned, slowly shaking his head as he looked down at her in confusion. "I beg your pardon. I believe it was to build a relic. For me." He stilled, gaze fixed to hers. She could practically see his mind work as he tried to make sense of her words. But before he had the chance to figure it out on his own, she went on to clarify it for him. "It was something Lysias said," she said, "when Thales attacked you. He told me that the crest stone inside your chest is that of Noah, and that they needed it to power a relic for me." She watched Hubert's eyebrows knit together. He lowered their held hands so that they hung between their bodies again. "That would explain it," he murmured, his gaze moving away to focus on the water beyond her. She blinked at him. She'd expected him to get angry, or at least show a bit more shock at this revelation, but he was incredibly calm considering the circumstances. "Explain what?" He sighed heavily, shaking his head again. "You are a magical marvel in your own right," he said, "and perhaps under different circumstances, I might not have batted an eye at the feats you accomplished in Shambhala. But you were already exhausted, and my own feeble reserves should not have strengthened you so remarkably. However, if the Elder Sharing spell somehow allowed you to draw from the power of the crest stone in my chest," he gave her a thoughtful look, as though he could suddenly gaze through her. "Your crest already works to preserve your energy beyond what is normally possible. It is not entirely implausible that the Noah crest stone strengthens that ability, allowing you to somehow draw even more efficiently from the energy that remains. I shall have to task Linhard with looking into this possibility." "You mean you might be my relic?" The possibility hadn't even occurred to her, that another human being could grant similar powers to a relic. Then again, up until just recently, she hadn't even known that there were live human beings walking around with crest stones rather than hearts powering their bodies. "In a sense," he said, "I suppose. Although it is likely the effect would be heightened if the crest stone was paired with a true relic from Noah. Powerful as I may be, I am not your ancestor." "Fortunately," she huffed. That caused him to smile wryly, giving an almost frightening impression in true Vestra fashion. She felt her cheeks warm at his knowing gaze. Suddenly, holding his hand in hers was almost too intense. But she wouldn't pull away, not when she knew how flighty Hubert could be with these things. If she showed even an ounce of hesitation, she feared that he might withdraw into his shell completely yet again, resetting what little progress they had made. So instead, and even though she felt almost ready to faint at the thought, she reached out and took his other hand in hers as well. His smile instantly faded, exchanged for a wary expression. "I know we should discuss what consequences may arise from this," she said quietly, making certain to hold his gaze steadily, "but please, let us first talk about what we have both been horribly bad at concluding all this time, our future." She almost added it together at the end, but she realized just in time that he may not truly want a future together with her. Her own wishes notwithstanding, she would not simply assume what he did and did not want from their relationship. Hubert's face seemed to grow pale, but to his credit, he mostly kept up a collected facade. Yes, he said in a somewhat strained voice. The matter of the curse momentarily aside. I have spoken with Lady Edelgard, and I have an offer for you. Constance widened her eyes. An offer? That he had discussed with the Empress? She drew for air. Could this be? She hadn't expected him to get to the proposal quite this quickly, not that she would complain. 2 offers, to be more exact, he continued. You may choose between them. Her thoughts stilled. 2 offers. You're all right, she croaked out, not knowing what to believe. Her Majesty is impressed with your magical feats and your dedication to the Adrestian Empire, he said. As a token of her gratitude, she has offered to reinstate House Novelli and provide you with monetary compensation for the restoration of your village. In other words, you may return to Novelli and rebuild what was stolen from you during the Dada Brigid War, take back your rightful noble title. Oh. She supposed she should be incredibly happy about that news. After all, was this not what she had strived for ever since that fateful day when she lost everything? This was what she had worked so hard to achieve for the past 10 years, and now that it dangled in front of her eyes, she did not quite know how to react. Was this his idea of a happy future for the 2 of them? Or was it? Was it his way of telling her that he did not, in fact, even want a future with her? That is very gracious of the Empress, she said, forcing an unnatural smile. And, the second offer? He cleared his throat. Ah, yes. Lady Edelgard has also been so kind as to offer you a position by her side, as her personal mage. You would be living in the Imperial Palace and working closely with me in providing protection for Her Majesty, as well as dedicating yourself to magical research for the benefit of the Empire as a whole. I'm afraid this option does not include a restoration of House Novelli. However, he glanced down at their interwoven hands, swallowing visibly before raising his gaze to meet hers. Perhaps, if you deemed it suitable, you might choose to join House Vestra instead. Constance's next breath hitched in her throat. Surely not. Aye, she breathed, taken aback. Hubert. Are you? Is that a proposal? He let out a sharp exhalation that could indicate either nervousness or amusement. She didn't quite have the faculties to discern between them at the moment. I suppose it is, he said simply. She pulled away, letting her hand slip out of his before she brought one of them to her chest, a restlessness gripping her body. She needed to pace, she needed to move, to think, to consider. She turned around and took 3 quick strides away from him, stopped to stare out over the dark stream, then spun around again. Surely you cannot be serious, she exclaimed, watching his expression darken. You cannot possibly mean to propose to me in such a, she searched for the right word, exasperatedly waving her right hand in the air as though conjuring a spell. Such a plain manner. I am the last standing scion of House Novelli. My skill, my intelligence, is unmatched, and after everything you and I have been through together. After all these years of secrets and forbidden magic and darkness and lies, after dozens of thoughtful letters and romantic insinuations, you ask me for my hand as a mere afterthought. No, this is not how it is supposed to be. This is not right. Hubert stood silently where she had left him. His gaze was calculating, almost cold, and his mouth downturned. Perhaps he was angry, and so be it, then. Do you even love me? She challenged him, her voice reaching higher notes. Do you even want to marry me? Considering your nonchalant proposal just now, one might be justified in thinking you did it merely out of a sense of obligation rather than for true love. By now, Hubert's gaze was so dark and his mouth so tight that she nearly expected him to burst. But instead, he began to walk with slow, precise strides toward her. She took a step back, holding her breath as he came closer. He stopped less than 3 feet away, and with his full height towering over her, the top of her head only reaching to his collarbones, the rest of the words she had saved for last immediately died in her throat. His eyes raked over her face, drinking in her expression, which she doubted hid her feelings very well, but she stood tall, trying her best to emanate confidence. There is something else I have yet to tell you, he said. Something which piqued your interest a while back but that I refused to explain when you asked me. Her eyebrows knitted together as she tried to process his words. Did this have anything at all to do with what had just happened, or had he simply decided to change the subject without warning? She opened her mouth to ask, but stopped herself when he shook his head. "Bear with me." She closed her mouth again, watching as he walked around to stand behind her. One of his hands came up to touch her shoulder, and despite herself, she jumped, then immediately felt stupid for her reaction. "I am referring to the day of our chess game," he said, "and the magic I used to shield you from the sun." With only a single sentence, her curiosity was piqued again. Yes, she remembered that day very well. He had been careless and forgotten to think of the reflections in the pond, causing her to figure out what he had done. When she had asked him how he did it, he simply told her to leave it. It was not light magic, she said, recalling what little information he had revealed to her. No, it was not. Is it possible to achieve the same effect with elder magic? No. His hand edged closer to her hair, moving it slightly to the side as he neared her neck. Elder magic can be used for many things, he said quietly. Whether good or bad depends on the wielder. But it has its restrictions. He leaned in toward her, then carefully tucked her hair away from her neck completely, allowing his breath to puff against the side of her face. She shivered pleasantly at the unexpected intimacy, already feeling blood rush to her cheeks. For example, he continued as he gently placed his hands on her shoulders, "I have yet to find a way that I can play with light and create new things in the environment in the way that you can do so elegantly with your faith magic. What you showed me in the pond that day truly was breathtaking." His hand slipped down from her shoulders to her arms. At the same time, he leaned in further, far enough that she could feel his lips brush against the top of her ear. "However," he said in a near whisper, "there is something that elder magic can do which faith magic cannot. Something that you have only yet had a small taste of." He fell silent, and she realized with a small jolt that she had closed her eyes somewhere along the line. She opened them now, letting out a single word in little more than a breath. "What?" He took a step back, letting his hands drop completely. "Turn around." Slowly, uncertain of what to expect, she did as he said. At first, she saw nothing out of place. Then Hubert met her gaze, and in an instant, their surroundings began to change. The dark, murky hallways and brooks of abyss faded, being exchanged for an explosion of color and light. Constance raised a hand to her face to shield her eyes, bending her neck to peer up at the blue sky that was quickly opening up above her. All around them, the abyss-Xi'an walls and their mounted candles changed into large trees, lush rose bushes and all kinds of colorful flowers and plants along a gravel path that had appeared beneath their feet. Even the sounds changed, the low hums, distant echoes and dripping water faded out and turned into birdsong, the rustle of leaves and music flowing toward them from the distance. A soft breeze passed by, caressing her face and stirring her hair. The scent of roses, coupled with the barest hint of the sea, filled her nose. Mouth falling open, Constance spun around to take it all in. This was familiar. Too familiar. Everything she expected to see as she let her gaze roam was there: the proud white buildings nearby, the entrance to a neat and well-groomed labyrinth built entirely out of bushes, a compound with a surface like a perfect mirror, not a single little detail out of place from what she could remember. And when she once again looked up, the sky was completely blue, but there was no sun visible anywhere. Still, she could feel its warmth on her arms and face. "Hubert, what this is?" "The Novelli Gardens," he said matter-of-factly, taking in the area with a calm expression. "Quite the beautiful place." "Hubert," she repeated, impatient now. "What is this magic? How are you doing this? Even with light magic, I could never create something this vivid." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he met her gaze again. "Ah, yes," he said. "Vivid. Didn't I once tell you in the compendium that elder magic can be used to create vivid dreams?" She stared at him, then looked to her sides again, studying her surroundings with more suspicion this time. But everything was still just as she could remember from her childhood. And this was nothing like when he had warned her to flee Shambhala in a dream. This was much more colorful and faithful to reality, complete with sense and everything. "Surely this cannot be a dream. As far as I recall, I am wide awake." "Indeed," he confirmed. "This is not a dream. But the same kind of magic can be used to fool the mind that it is experiencing something from its past, be it a full memory, a person, or a location. As such, it will be effective even when the target is awake. We are still standing in Abyss, but your mind is playing a trick on your senses, causing you to experience the gardens of your old home in Novelli. And after I have shaped the scene, I can make the necessary adjustments, such as removing little details. Last time, I merely laid an image of a sky without a sun on top of the real sky. Everything else was untouched. Constance drew in a deep breath. The scents, the sounds, the feeling of gravel beneath her feet. It all felt so incredibly real. Perhaps even more real than Abyss had felt before they left for this place. Would she also be able to cast elder magic like this, or would she need to go through the ritual first? Unlike your light magic, this does not truly exist outside the boundaries of your mind, he continued. I cannot make anyone else experience what we are currently seeing. And you, she asked, noting how he said we. How come you can see it? He cleared his throat. She turned her head to look at him again, narrowing her eyes when she saw the discomfort on his face. Yes, that is why I never told you how I removed the sun for you. In order to bring forth a memory, I need to reach into your subconscious mind and pull it back to the forefront of your attention. I experience it with you because... well, because you are reading my mind, she said, shocked at her own words. She hadn't known such a thing was even possible. Not quite, he hurried to assure her. I know only what we are currently seeing. There is no mind reading involved, I can only locate and recreate a memory if I already know it exists. I know of this place because you showed part of it in the pond the day that you cast your light spell. However, the spell only works if I let myself in, so to speak. Remind me never to get in your bad graces, she said with an incredulous scoff. I assume this is quite the useful tool to have in interrogations and such. He didn't reply with words, but his shadowed expression told her all that she needed to know. Best not to ask. Then again, all magic could be used for both bad and good, she supposed. She closed her eyes and breathed the sense in again. When she exhaled, all of her muscles seemed to exhale with her. She still didn't feel completely comfortable with the idea of Hubert digging around in her memories, but at the moment, she was too wrapped up in the bliss of being back at her old home that she didn't mind enough to complain. And she assumed he must have created it for a reason. Which reminded her of what they had been discussing before he decided to show her all of this. She opened her eyes again, confused at first when she didn't see Hubert anywhere, but then she realized that he was crouching on the ground in front of her. No, not crouching. He was. Her heart jumped. He was standing on one knee. As she watched in stunned silence, he moved one hand behind his back while offering the other to her, palm up. For a moment, he simply held her gaze, as if to gauge her reaction. And perhaps he appreciated what he found in her expression, for he didn't wait long before choosing to speak. Lady Constance von Novelli, he said in a low voice that made a small shiver run through her. Sorcery incarnate, mistress of reason. You are already on your way to conquering the darkness. Rule the shadows with me, and I shall help you conquer the light as well. Her heart was practically galloping in her chest at this point. She brought a hand to the middle of her chest in an attempt to calm herself down, but all it did was make her heartbeats even more distinct. Although she supposed this was theoretically his second proposal, meaning that she should have expected what was to come, she couldn't help but feel dazed at the image in front of her, Hubert kneeling on the ground, in the gardens of her childhood home, with his bright gaze earnestly focused on her. Even in his simple, dark outfit, with the lower edge of the cape pooling on the gravel beneath them, he was absolutely stunning in that moment. I'm afraid I can offer you no ring just yet, he added in an apologetic tone. I intended to purchase one in third Iad, but there was no time. However, I assure you that I will get you one post-haste. Hubert, she breathed. Her next words caught in her throat. She wanted to say yes, she wanted so badly to say yes. But as she gazed down at him, taking in the webbed pattern on his hand and the edge of his gloves sticking out from his pocket, she realized that although he had been unexpectedly honest with her today, a small doubt still persisted in the deepest recesses of her mind. And she knew that this doubt, deep and dark and shameful, needed to come into the light before she could give him her answer, before she could confidently accept him as her husband. She swallowed, feeling faint at the thought. Hubert. Yes. His voice was level but wary, as though he was already preparing for a rejection. "I wish to ask you something," she said in a trembling voice, "and I need you to answer sincerely." He clenched his jaw, then gave a short nod. "I see. And what is your question?" "If I accepted your allegiance to Lady Edelgard, and acknowledged that I would always come second." She paused, momentarily doubting herself. She could still stop here, never get an answer to her question, and try to live as happily as she could without knowing. Perhaps she would be better off not hearing the truth. But she was Constance von Novelli, a magical prodigy and researcher, and what kind of researcher worth their salt would shy away from the truth? She couldn't back down now. "Would you truly want to spend your life with me? Would you love and care for me on your own free will, both as an equal and a friend, and as a—" she drew in a shaky breath. "As a woman?" Something changed in his expression then, and she realized he must have expected her to ask something completely different, for his tightly clenched muscles immediately loosened, his face falling as he seemed to marvel over the question. To her surprise, he stood up then, taking both of her hands in his as he gazed down at her with something almost tender in his eyes. "I can see why that would be of concern to you," he said quietly. "Truthfully, I have never had a reason to even consider marrying for personal reasons before. I always assumed that whenever I did marry, it would be simply because it was beneficial to Lady Edelgard, whether for her political gains, or to produce an heir to serve as vassal to hers. I didn't see myself ever marrying for love. It wasn't exactly something I mourned, seeing how no one ever caught my interest. But now, after coming to know you and developing feelings unlike any I have encountered before, at last, I've learned what it feels like to yearn for something for my own, selfish reasons. And I've realized that I want more than I ever believed I could have." The sound of birds twittering in a nearby tree and scent of roses from the garden were all but drowned out by the light gleaming in his eyes as he raised a hand to her cheek. She sighed softly as his fingers caressed her skin, running carefully along the side of her jaw before stroking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. He smiled, and while that smile held some small amount of insecurity, the happiness seemed unusually pure on him. "If you could accept the necessary conditions for a marriage with me, then I would gladly spend the rest of my life doing my best to please you, in any way that I could. Whether that be as your confidant, your tutor, and your friend, or as a man." His voice dipped a few steps lower than usual at the last few words, and Constance's heart nearly sprung out of her chest. Her knees suddenly weak, she was incredibly grateful when Hubert reached down to wrap an arm around her waist in order to keep her steady. In doing so, she inadvertently came much closer to him, and the sudden closeness made her gasp. Hubert exhaled in what could be either amusement or relief. He gazed down at her, still smiling, and by the goddess, she wanted to kiss him. She wanted to grab his cheeks and pull him down to her level and kiss him, breathe his air, merge with his body, feel his emotions. But when she gripped the front of his shirt and stood on tiptoe to reach him, he straightened further instead of leaning in to meet her, making it impossible for her to reach his lips. "Was my reply to your satisfaction?" he asked in a teasing voice. At first she just tooted at him, but then she decided to play along. "Oh, so satisfactory, my lord," she said in an exaggeratedly breathless and awestruck voice. "You truly know how to please a woman, don't you?" Hubert's face instantly fell, his cheeks coloring. She couldn't help the giggle that slipped out then. Perhaps she had gone slightly overboard. To be quite honest, she was not entirely sure where those lines had come from, but while she felt a sliver of shame now, it was almost titillating. As Hubert's first shock died down, amusement returned to his eyes, and he began to laugh. It was a low, discreet laughter, but it still filled her with relief and joy. His laugh felt reserved for her, it felt private and special. "If that is all you need from me, I believe I shall indeed be able to satisfy you." She sighed and shook her head as he chuckled one last time. "Now that is not what a woman wants to hear." He squeezed her waist, causing her to yelp and jerk slightly in his grip. He took the opportunity to tug her closer, and before she knew it, her body was flat against his. Feeling her own cheeks heat rapidly, she looked up at his face and saw that his smile had been exchanged for an intense, almost possessive gaze that he now aimed straight down at her. "I do believe," he murmured in that low voice again, "that I know what this woman wants to hear." Her breath caught in her throat, causing her reply to come out breathlessly this time, in full sincerity. "Oh." Moving his free hand to gently grip her chin, he guided her face upward, then lowered his own head and leaned in until she could feel his breath on her lips. She closed her eyes expectantly, but then he paused just there, causing her eyes to flicker open again. As their gazes met, he whispered, "Will you marry me?" She gasped, and in what seemed to be an almost subconscious action on his part, he parted his own lips to share in the breath. "Yes," she breathed, but the sound was immediately muffled when she pushed herself up on tiptoe and met his mouth with hers. His hand slipped away from her chin and moved to the back of her head, his fingers already tangling with her hair as she pushed herself into him with her whole body. She kissed him firmly and urgently, smiling when he groaned softly in response. But this time, this kiss, he was neither in a weakened state nor uncertain about their future together, and it showed. It showed in how he met her tongue without a sliver of hesitation, in how his hands roamed lower and lower on the back of her body, and then, when he seemed to tire of the difference between their heights, in how he hooked his hands around her thighs and hoisted her upward, decisively guiding her legs around his torso. She gasped as her body erupted in a sudden heat wave, incredibly grateful to her past self for choosing to wear tights beneath her short skirt. She only just registered how he swiped a hand to the side to teleport them over to the nearest wall before he pushed her up against it with an ardor that completely stole her breath away. He pulled away from her mouth and lowered his head to kiss her neck instead, one hand clasping the backside of her thigh by his side while the other palm pressed against the wall next to her shoulder. The sensation of his fingertips digging into her sensitive skin, even through the tights, made her throw her head back and draw for air as she tried to collect her thoughts. "Hubert," she breathed, gripping his shoulders. This isn't proper." He paused beneath her ear, panting softly against her skin. "Do you wish me to stop?" Her head swam with indecision, heart pounding at the intensity of it all. Her body being wedged between him and the wall, she could feel every single one of his breaths as though they were her own, and his body heat enveloped her from all directions, causing her to just about boil in her clothes. With her legs locked around him like this, she was fairly certain this was the most intimate she had ever been with anyone, even Yuri, and while her body was practically screaming at her to tell him to continue, some sense of propriety and reason still remained in her brain. Perhaps she should slow down just slightly, save the urgency for a later date. "Well. And no, not really, but," she stammered out, even now unable to ask him to stop. Hubert hummed out a soft laugh, planting one last kiss on her neck before starting to pull away. He graciously helped her down on her feet, then lifted a hand to cup her cheek. His lips were a darker color than usual, and his eyes were more alive than she had ever seen them. He was breathtaking to look at. "Right," he said lightly, still somewhat out of breath. "I suppose we'll have to continue this on our wedding night, then." He smirked as her mouth fell open, and for a moment he looked almost joyfully devious. Constance quickly cast down her gaze, afraid that she would burst into flames if she looked at him for even a second longer. "Right," she echoed. She could barely hear her own voice over the thrumming of her heart in her chest. Since when is Hubert von Vestra such a charmer? Was it the certainty of finally understanding that she truly wanted him that had made him this bold? He looked more relaxed and carefree than ever before, almost as an entirely different person compared to the dark and dour man she had first met. As she tried to catch her breath, the bright colors, vibrant sounds, and sweet scents of the Novelli gardens faded away, exchanged for the murkiness of abyss. She realized she still stood with her back against a wall, and wondered distantly whether the image of the gardens was simply painted onto their normal surroundings, or whether she would have felt leaves tickle her fingers if she had brushed them against one of the bushes. She suspected she would have more opportunities to experiment with that in the future. For now, she settled with mustering enough courage to look up at Hubert's face again. As she met his gaze, he smiled again, but this time it was more of a pleasant smile than a devious one. She exhaled in relief. She didn't know whether she would have been able to withstand that smirk a second time without combusting. She supposed she must have looked quite amusingly dazed, because his smile seemed to quiver somewhat, and then he cleared his throat and looked away, bringing his hands behind his back. "Well then," he said, as though to give himself a moment to fully regain his senses. "I suppose I should give you a chance to cool down and—" "What?" she exclaimed. "No. You are not leaving me with Yuri." He will know as soon as he sees me. There will be no end to his teasing. Hubert raised an intrigued eyebrow. I find that difficult to believe. You do not know him the way I do. Either way, I am coming with you, she said firmly. Before he could argue, she hooked her arm in his and looked up at him with a decisive gaze. Where to? He sighed, but when he met her eyes, he was smiling. The Shadow Library, I suppose. I heard you know your way around the place. Care to give me a proper tour? Ahaha, she laughed, already nudging him forward. Know my way around? I am practically the librarian. Come with me, and I'll acquaint you with what must surely be the best place in Fodlan to delve into the mysteries of magic. As Yuri made his way to the inn that night, he caught the sound of voices coming from the Shadow Library. Halting his steps, he strained his ears to listen. Was that? Yes, that was definitely Constance's laughter. With soft steps, he slipped over to the shadows by the doorway and peeked inside. The sight that met him was so unexpected he could only stare at it in silence. Hubert von Vestra stood in front of one of the innermost bookshelves, holding an open book in his left hand. But his attention was focused on the woman standing with her back against the shelf, gazing up at him with an enthusiastic smile on her lips as she talked to him in an eager voice, a woman dressed in a short dress and tights, with long blonde ringlets of hair flowing down over her shoulders and her hands hidden behind her back. The two stood so close to each other that they were nearly touching, and while Hubert seemed to be in the middle of browsing the shelves, he smiled down at her with such warmth that Yuri almost doubted that it was even him for a second. We need to invite the Agirs, of course, she rattled happily, if only so I can revel in Ferdinand's envy when he sees the grandness of it all. Of course, Hubert echoed in an amused voice. Oh. And I shall need to ask Happy about those extremely delicious pastries she sometimes shares with me. Which brings me to the food. Do you think Yuri will want to cook? No, of course not, silly me, he shall be invited as a guest, of course, not a servant. How are the cooks at the palace, Hubert? Do you think they will do? I've never found a reason to complain, but I'll leave that assessment as well as the final decision to you. Constance sighed happily, watching as Hubert exchanged his book for a new one and casually flipped through its pages. She gasped and jumped eagerly then, her eyes lighting up as they always did when she drew something exciting to mind. Oh, the dress. Oh, what color should it be? I suppose it is tradition for the bride to wear white, but I do look stunning in lavender pink. Perhaps in combination with white lace? What do you think? Hubert. He said, gaze running across one of the pages in the current book. Constance reached up to grab his collar, causing him to return his attention to her. Lavender pink, he repeated then. Is that the color you wore in your dream? She giggled, smoothing her hands over his shirt. Close enough. Then yes, he said, lowering his head to place a gentle kiss on her forehead. You do look quite stunning in it. Just you wait, she said in a somewhat lower voice as she held him in place with her hands clasping his collar again. You have seen nothing yet. She tugged him down into a full kiss, at which Yuri finally managed to tear himself away. He swallowed, trying to decide what he felt about what he had just seen. Happy? Not exactly. Relieved? Not in the slightest, far from it, actually. But, nevertheless, there was something almost contagious about Constance's joy, and he found himself smiling a confused smile as he steered his steps toward the inn again. He didn't think he'd ever trust Hubert, or forgive him for that matter. But he clearly made Constance happy, and if anything, that was probably enough to at least bury the hatchet. For now. Check the description for the links to the author.